our committee meeting. Mr. Hicks?
So I've been challenged by Representative Stewart and his colleague to have a brief opening statement, so I'll try to do that. I filed a report. It slows it down when people smirk when I say that. I filed 2 reports in this matter. I think I'll be able to prove the allegations in both reports very clearly and very convincingly today that relate to failure to complete an accurate statement, failure to keep a strict accounting of contributions, and acceptance of direct or corporate contributions. So just as a quick layout, this all emerged because I had come some invoices relating to the 2020 primary involving strategy and media, and found an invoice that had approximately 6 candidates on it. And as you know, all those candidates on that invoice that had no reporting of financial contribution expenses to strategy and media or constant content, these are all Larry Householder era things, that I have pursued. So those have been 3, I won't name the names, this is one of them. I have pursued because of the fact that there was nothing on their campaign finance reporting that seemed to reflect the activities that were being performed on their campaigns related to the Larry Householder team or organization. So just, there's a reason why there's 2 complaints. The first complaint related to media because the original invoice that I found where there was nothing on the campaign finance report related to radio advertising, production of radio advertising. When Mr. Stewart filed a response to that, he talked about print media, which was different than what my actual complaint was about. And then I dug into that and found out there was a whole print media element of it that had not been reported. And that's what the second complaint are. They're both tied together, same organization, same campaign. And so today I'll take you through the facts on it and I think pretty convincingly show that there was a failure to report things. And as we know, you might not have passed an advisory opinion today, but the matters associated with these kind of things have already now been through the appeals court and rejected for further consideration by the Supreme Court. So that is my opening statement. Thank you.
Members of the Commission, my name is Brian Stewart. I'm one of the respondents. I'm also representing the respondents as legal counsel, and I would like to introduce my co-counsel, Attorney Brian Garbine, who will be helping in the presentation of our case today. I've served in public office for the last 15 years as a councilman for the Village of Asheville, as Pickaway County Commissioner, and I'm now in my 2nd term as State Representative for Ohio's 12th District. I've been an attorney in private practice for 14 years. I am an entry veteran of the Iraq War. And across 10 consecutive winning campaigns, my campaign committee has filed literally dozens and dozens of campaign finance reports across those various campaigns, none of which have ever been cited for any inaccuracies or any deficiencies by any actual reviewing authority at either the county level or the state level, including the reports that are the subject of Mr. Hicks' complaints today. Moreover, the complainant has never been my constituent. He has never spoken to me prior to this case. He lives in a community that is 100 miles from the nearest edge of my district. I also want to note, based on some testimony from earlier today, I find it incredible that Mr. Hicks just argued to you in the immediately preceding matter that he should not be held liable for a reporting deficiency because he didn't receive notice that a report was due. He is arguing in our case to hold us to the exact opposite standard after 2.5 years. That's fascinating. Now, the claimant has already disclosed the minuscule amount of evidence that he actually has for you today. It paints a very clear picture. There is not one shred of evidence that Friends of Brian Stewart was ever made aware of any ad buy being made for a radio ad. There is no evidence that the committee was ever informed that such ad was running. There's no evidence that any invoice or any other form of notice was given to the committee after the ad ran. And there's also no evidence that any entity who allegedly ran the radio ad ever reported that ad as an in-kind expenditure to Friends of Brian Stewart or anybody else. In the same vein, there's no evidence that any mailers were sent in support of Friends of Brian Stewart, which were not properly accounted for on all the committee's campaign finance reports. There's no evidence of any invoice being sent to Friends of Brian Stewart for any alleged unpaid debt prior to the filing of the committee's 2020 campaign finance reports. And so complainant's position is that even if the committee is entirely unaware of an alleged in-kind contribution, the committee breaks the law by not reporting the expenditure which it admittedly knew nothing about. In other words, not only must candidates comply with a mountain of pretty complex campaign finance regulations, but they have to be psychic as well. Complainant's position is that a committee must also report bogus, unsubstantiated demands for payment from cranks, grifters, and in this case, literally, a vendor who was under pending indictment for racketeering, money laundering, and fraud. His position is we have to report that as a valid debt, no questions asked, on the campaign's finance reports. Commissioners, that is absurd. If his pleadings to this point are any indication, the complaint is going to refer to other candidates from prior cases that have been before this commission who were also candidates in the 2020 Republican primary. Both these other candidates worked with the campaign operation for former sitting Speaker of the House. But commissioners, that is where the similarities to my case end. There is a massive distinction between the candidates in those other races because I was endorsed in the 2020 Republican primary by the Ohio Republican Party. Those other candidates, Alan Freeman and Gene Schmidt, I'll say the names so we're all on the same page for the record. Those candidates were not endorsed by the state party. And this is hugely significant because it means that everything sent out in support of Friends of Brian Stewart was sent by the Ohio Republican Party, marked, paid for by the Ohio Republican Party, not Friends of Brian Stewart. The Ohio Republican Party then reported all of those expenditures in furtherance of my campaign as in-kind contributions. Friends of Brian Stewart then properly reported all those in-kind expenditures by the Ohio Republican Party on our own campaign finance reports. Friends of Brian Stewart got a benefit from being endorsed by the party because the state party sends mail at a vastly discounted rate compared to a normal candidate committee. So there is no incentive, there's no reason for Friends of Brian Stewart to have ever sent mail ourselves at double the rate that it was going to be sent by the state party. To be clear, the Ohio Republican Party produced the mailers, they sent the mailers, not Friends of Brian Stewart. Complainant knows all this. That's why his entire case to this point has been about inferences, hunches, assumptions, accusations in search of fact. He has the burden to prove his own claims with actual evidence, not just conjecture. And we look forward to rebutting those claims. We thank you for your attention.
Okay.
May I ask a question? Is Nelson Embers present?
He is not.
Okay. And who is he represented by?
He's represented by us.
So if you're pro se representing yourself, you cannot represent another party in the same matter.
Sure.
Not according to courts in Ohio.
It's not true.
You may have adverse interest.
I'm not going to debate with the complainant. I mean, this has been pending for 2.5 years. We're representing all the respondents. Respondents extended and represented by our firm.
Mr. Hicks, do you want to go forth with your case?
Yes, I'm going to call myself first.
Well, why don't you go to you're probably better off over there.
Okay, I forgot to take my microphone back when I turned it on. So I have the exhibits, so I'll be referencing the exhibits in here. I'll be correcting myself too. So the first question I asked myself is just to provide background on how these complaints came about. And I would refer myself to Exhibit A, and I'll refer you to Exhibit A, which is in the pack that I sent. At the bottom of each page, there's page numbers in kind of a blue color, colorblind stuff. And so I'll correct, page 2 in that blue numbering is the beginning of Exhibit A. So my explanation of how this came about is that there were 5 candidates that were on an invoice that is on page 6, which is Exhibit 1 within Exhibit A. those 5 candidates all had activities that were billed to, as you will see from that invoice, constant content.
1 second,
Yeah, he was sworn, just a reminder that you've been sworn.
So those 5 candidates, in my original complaint, if you go back to Exhibit 3, I did an analysis of those 5 candidates and began an investigation to build my personal knowledge on what had happened with each of them. So 2 of them, Tom Young and Blanton, showed expenses related to constant content, and therefore I've not done anything with them. The other 3, I investigated further to figure out what had actually happened. That investigation involved looking at the campaign finance reports, which reported at Exhibit A, and Brian Stewart, and finding that there were no within those campaign finance filings, there were no references to any billings to constant content, to strategy and media, or to any such entities. I filed the complaint at that point in time. If you look at what in my file is Exhibit B, starting on page 23, based on the numbers down at the bottom, Exhibit B, Mr. Stewart had responded and provided a copy to me, which is on page 32, of a letter from him responding to Attorney David Goldstein about a request from David Goldstein for some $13,000 in payment associated with work that had been done by constant content for Mr. Stewart's campaign. The next complaint, the second complaint, which is starting on page 33, is because of the Mr. Stewart raising the print items caused me to file a second complaint around the print items. He subsequently produced, if you go back to Exhibit D, which is the page number is labeled B47, page 37. I think it's a little bit blocked out by the actual mailers on there, but it's the first one that's a mailer. A set of mailers that are all labeled as paid for by Friends of Brian Stewart, not labeled as paid for by Ohio Republican Party, again produced by Mr. Stewart in this matter. So the second part of the complaint is that these mailers were also something never shown on a campaign finance report. Mr. Stewart got up here and made some statements. So I'm going to question myself on those statements. Am I holding Mr. Stewart to an opposite standard of what I just argued a few minutes ago? Not at all. I was talking about notice statutorily required by a Board of Elections for the filing of a candidate report. Mr. Stewart is talking about something that he was involved with. He produced the mailers to me. He knew what was going on. He knew there were activities taking place. In a minute, I'm going to play a radio ad that he's the voiceover at the end of the radio ad. But he claims he knew nothing about this. There was nothing to report. There was nothing to investigate. The second thing I would ask myself is that he made a statement, Mr. Stewart just made a statement, that he was entirely unaware of these activities. I think that that will be belied by in a moment me playing the radio ad where he is the voiceover. So what I'd like to do right now is introduce the radio ad, which is Exhibit G, which I'll play if I pleasures ago, I'll play the radio ad.
Mr. Hicks, what page do you have on?
Exhibit G is, I'm going to play it's a media file,
Right.
but it's back on, it says page 59.
Thank you. Got it. Got it. All right.
veteran, battle-tested conservative, Brian Stewart will always defend our conservative values. Stewart served in Iraq, earning the Combat Infantryman's Badge and the Army Commendation Medal twice for protecting our nation. Here at home, Brian Stewart served as Pickaway County Commissioner and opened his own business, growing our economy and creating jobs. At the State House, Stewart will continue to defend our conservative values. That's why Brian Stewart is the only candidate endorsed by the Ohio Republican Party. Stewart will work to cut red tape so we can grow local businesses and create jobs. Brian Stewart's pledge to defend our God-given constitutional rights has earned him an AQ rating from the Buckeye Firearms Association, the highest rating earned by a non-incumbent. And Stewart is committed to protecting innocent life. That's why he's the only candidate endorsed by Ohio Right to Life, a battle-tested conservative who won't back down. Support Brian Stewart for state representative on March 17th.
Paid for by Friends of Brian Stewart.
So I received that copy of that radio ad from Mr. Stewart, and if I direct you back to my original complaint on the blue pages at the bottom, it's Exhibit A, but it's the blue numbers, it's page 6. And you'll see that that invoice contains a line item for $1,100 for radio production for Stewart, and a line item for $9,686 for airtime related to Brian Stewart. So when I developed the complaint, based on this invoice, and then later received a copy of that ad from Brian Stewart, it belies, I thought it belied credibility that some would say that it knew nothing of what was going on. Or as he said, it's entirely unaware when you had been personally involved in the production of a radio spot. And if just that, when I looked at this invoice, that's $1,100. And that is something that he was aware of, just as I believe from my complaints that he was aware of. I also believe that he was aware of the mailers because he sent me the mailers. He made statements around the Ohio Republican Party, so I would ask myself to comment on those, and do I believe that those have veracity to them? The answer is they don't. He stood up here and said everything the Ohio Republican Party did was labeled Ohio Republican Party. I agree with that. All the mailers that relate to Ohio Republican Party, I think he has a bunch of them in his exhibits, they all say paid for by the Ohio Republican Party. And then he put those on his campaign finance report. I'm not talking about this. And those shouldn't get conflated. That radio ad just ended with paid for by who? Friends of Brian Stewart. The pieces that I've included that came from Brian Stewart, which is Exhibit D in the package that I sent you, those mailers.
Mr. Hicks, I'm sorry, can you give the page number that makes it a little easier?
Yeah, the page number for that one is 47, but it's kind of the way the mailer printed. You'll see it's a big mailer. It kind of cut off the page number, so the page number is not visible on those pages, but it would be 47. If you find 46, it's the next page. So I'm talking specifically about those that have nothing to do with the Ohio Republican Party, and I think it was pure conflation on the part of Mr. Stewart to come up here and say that, to conflate those issues of Ohio Republican Party versus things that were done in the name of his campaign committee, Friends of Brian Stewart. I didn't call a witness of the ORP, but my experience is they do everything, and Mr. Stewart confirmed, labeled as paid for by the Ohio Republican Party, not paid for by a candidate committee. In terms of the print part of it, that I became aware of largely because of Mr. Stewart, in his response to my media complaint, I would ask myself about how did I investigate that further. I had a call with David Goldstein, who is an attorney who was serving as a collection agent for Constant Content. In that call, in the first couple minutes of that call, we talked extensively, providing Tony Bear had this exhibit from before. We talk extensively about his efforts to collect from Brian Stewart's campaign specific to mailers, not media. It's actually part of the discussion. Not hot radio, not television, but specifically mailers in that. So that helped to build credibility to me that there was some there in terms of this. We all know that, I think that the 2020 campaign cycle was filled with things that are reprehensible to have in politics that violate the public trust. And that's why I spent a lot of time driving back and forth, spent a lot of time printing things out to try to get some of these cases where it's clear, again, in Mr. Stewart's case, that he was involved in the radio ads personally, he was involved in the mailers personally, he never showed any campaign personal expense, as can be seen in the campaign finance reports in this matter. He never showed any of these expenses. I would ask myself the question about what else did I do to try to verify the radio part of this. And so I would direct you to Exhibit H, which the page number, which is, I apologize, cut off a little bit, but it's page 60. I tried, I'm getting better with these page numbers. It's page 60. So what I did is I went out to the FCC database. Those of you might be aware, but everything involving radio and media, involving political campaigns, is warehoused in an FCC database. Very easy to go out there and search on campaigns and pull down the invoices. Candidates can do it. It seems that very few do. I do. And so the section that is Exhibit H, which starts on page 60, these are all the things that are available on the FCC database related to the radio buys that took place within the campaign. And then I want to direct you to Exhibit F, which is on page 54, and the page number is not cut off, so you can read it. And I'll call him later as a witness, if he's here. But the organization that did the work on the radio ads was Strategy and Media. In that part, you should be available for cross-examination. There's a affidavit by Scott Schweitzer that he did this work in conjunction with Constant Content for the battle-tested radio ad for the Brian Stewart campaign. Not at the direction of the Ohio Republican Party, but involved with Constant Content. And you've already heard Mr. Stewart being part of the actual radio ad. He further provided invoices that contain Brian Stewart items that are on page 57 and I believe 58, and that's coming from Strategy and Media there. It's worth noting that within his campaign finance reporting, Mr. Stewart had did a town hall. There was a teletown hall done by Strategy and Media, so he obviously knows somebody in Strategy and Media. Plus, he received a contribution from a person in Strategy and Media to his campaign. This stuff's all easily verifiable, and the reason why I brought the complaint is because I'm sick as a citizen of politicians that get up and claim that they didn't know, I couldn't have known, how could I have known, when it's obvious they should have known. I believe that citizens coming here, including me, who have been citizen candidates and are worried about $50 fines and whether they filed on time, and sometimes there's a bifurcated culture where there's a group that gets away with bloody murder sometimes. And what happens and what's reported that a regular citizen, that would never be an acceptable excuse to say, I was unaware of, or I was entirely unaware of a radio ad where I provided voiceover. So those are the main points that I would call myself as a witness, just to set up. I wanted to do that primarily because Mr. Goldstein was not available to testify today, as you guys may be aware. So, he kind of is the start of some of the chain here. So in lieu of him not being able to testify, I thought that I would try to testify myself first, and then get not excuse myself. I can be cross-examined now because I put myself out to testify, but also not excuse myself so I can be recalled later. I just wanted to set up the parameters and boundaries of this case and what's involved, and when we get past all of the, I'm totally supportive of veterans and all the bravado and all that kind of stuff, but this is a pretty simple thing. And I'm tired of, personally as a citizen, I'm tired of politicians playing dumb, even years after the event. At any time along this path, Mr. Stewart could have revised his campaign finance reports. And he could have walked in here and said, now that I'm aware of these things, I fixed it. But he's coming in with this opposite standard, entirely unaware stuff, and his campaign treasurer is not present, who was the campaign treasurer at the time of these things, because maybe the testimony would be different. That's the end of the testimony I wanted to give at this point, but I'm not excusing myself. You want to cross-examine me?
From here
Then we'll have you there and you can go to the podium. Yeah. It's a little bit convoluted, but it works.
I had a copy of your exhibits and my exhibits, so.
But we'll make sure, yeah, thank you.
With the commission's permission, just for the record, because I don't want to hide any balls here. It's a green. Okay. Yeah. Prior to this case,
Hold a little bit toward you.
Yeah.
The mic is
On top of the mic.
understood. Oh, it is better. Okay. Prior to the hearing today, in preparation, Mr. Hicks indicated that he did not plan to call Nelson Embry as a witness. I indicated that I also did not plan to call Nelson Embry as a witness. Nelson Embry is more than 80 years old. He was not heavily involved in the preparation of the report. He reviewed the report. Obviously, he was the treasurer at a period of time. I don't want to share too much personal information, but there's a health issue that precluded his being here today, and given that both parties had indicated that he would not be called to testify.
I will object. I did not ever indicate that I was not going to call Nelson Embry.
I have the email saying
Well, you
precisely
should
that.
produce it right now then,
Okay.
because it's false.
That is the reason why Mr. Embry is not here.
Can you produce the email?
I'm going to take my questions now. Thanks.
Well, I object to you putting something in the record that's false.
You can
And if
testify.
you can, you can claim that
It's
there's
your
an
turn. You
email,
can testify to it.
but I can object also.
Your objection is noted.
Is it sustained?
Not at this point, just go ahead, let's get on with the question.
Mr. Hicks, where do you live?
444 Woodward Court, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45255.
Have you ever been my constituent?
No.
Have you ever had any interactions with me prior to this case?
Prior to this case, we met when I was trying to advise you to just settle this case and fix your campaign reports. We met at the Starbucks somewhere around Capitol
The
Square.
question was, have you ever spoken to me prior to the filing of this case?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you. Alan Freeman was another candidate in the 2020 Republican primaries, correct?
Yes,
Gene Schmidt was another candidate in the 2020 primaries, correct?
yes,
Were those candidates endorsed by the Ohio Republican Party?
no,
Okay. Are you familiar with the fact that I was endorsed by the Ohio
Yeah.
Republican Party? Please let me finish my questions. We'll have a better transcript if you let me finish the question, and then I'll let you finish your answer. Are you aware of what happens when the Ohio Republican Party endorses a candidate in a primary?
I am absolutely aware, including having them testify in multiple hearings before this.
You're aware then that when the Ohio Republican Party endorses a candidate, they send mail on behalf of that candidate, correct?
I'm aware that they send mail all labeled as paid for by the Ohio Republican Party, and I find this to be a diversion from the reality of what the case before us is materials that were labeled paid for by the Friends of Brian Stewart.
We'll get to that. This case has been pending since March of 2022. Have you found any evidence that any demand for payment was made to Friends of Brian Stewart by Constant Content prior to the filing of the 2020 campaign finance reports?
I don't remember can I look at my exhibits to see when they were
You
filed?
can, it's not in there, but you can look.
Well, I'm going to look at see when they
Yeah.
were filed, because you made representations. So one was filed on March 4th, 2022, and the other one was filed, I think, a couple weeks after that. And can you repeat the question?
The question
I just
was,
wanted to get the dates down. Go ahead.
do you have any evidence that a payment demand was made to Friends of Brian Stewart by Constant Content prior to the filing of the 2020 campaign finance reports?
Yes, I do have that evidence.
What's that?
A letter from, your response letter, and we can always introduce the recording of me talking to Mr. Goldstein, but my evidence is that in your response, which in my packet of materials is part of Exhibit B, so the page at the bottom is 32.
Mr. Hicks, I don't think you're listening carefully to the question.
I'd like to be able to answer the question. You asked me,
Go
was
ahead.
I aware of any attempt to get collection from you from constant content
The
prior to
question
the
was-
filing of my complaint?
The question was, do you have evidence of a payment demand being made to
Yes.
Friends of Brian Stewart prior to the filing of the 2020 campaign finance reports?
No, but your
Okay.
first question was 2022, the
No.
filing of my complaints.
No, the question
And so
was
again-
the question I asked, and your answer was no.
Okay, so I have direct evidence from you that on September 5th, 2021, you responded to a request for payment on behalf of Constant Content Company by David Goldstein. So I think,
Mr. Hicks, what's the date on the letter from Friends of Brian Stewart to David Goldstein?
on the letter from Friends of Brian Stewart,
Yeah.
September 5th, 2021.
Okay, can we agree that the campaign finance reports for 2020 have been filed prior to September 5th, 2021?
Yes, and
Okay.
can we also agree that they can be amended to take in new information that becomes visible to the client, to the candidate? Can we agree on that?
The demand for payment was made after the filing of the 2020 campaign finance reports, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
We agree
Okay.
that you have an obligation to
If Friends of
candidate
Brian
to correct
Stewart-
campaign finance reporting that's wrong.
If Friends of Brian Stewart never received a demand for payment from Constant Content prior to the filing of the 2020 campaign finance reports, it would be impossible for the committee to report any such alleged debt, correct?
No, it would go back and revise that report
No, I'm not
once it
talking
became
about
aware.
amendments. I'm not
Or
talking
it would
about after the fact.
file it on the first report that it became aware of those obligations.
We're not talking about amendments, Mr. Hicks. We're not talking about what you think I should have done 2 years later. The question is, if the committee never got a bill prior to 2020 reports being due, how do they report that bill on the report?
They revise the report once they become aware of the bill.
I would
That's
ask
their
the
legal
executive
obligation to
director- yeah.
revise their campaign finance filing once they become aware of it.
I would ask the commission and the executive director to instruct the witness to answer the actual question that's been presented.
He's answering the question, but he's just going on his own path. So please
Is that allowed
answer
here?
directly based on the question asked,
Okay.
please.
If Friends of Brian Stewart has simply guessed at a number that it thinks it might have owed to Constant Content, the committee guessed wrong and filed the report with the wrong number, that would in and of itself have been a violation of campaign finance law, correct?
Fail to see that point because there's two candidates where I never took any action against because I would have no basis to know what they put in their report was the right number or not. The point here is the complete failure to report any number.
Mr. Chase, that's not the question. It's going to be helpful if you just answer the question. The question is, if the committee, Friends of Brian Stewart, pulled a number out of the sky and said, we think it might be this number, and reported that, and it's wrong, then by your standard, it's still a violation of campaign finance law.
No, it's not by my
Correct?
standards. So what's my standard then? You just described it as a violation of my standard. What's my standard?
In the 2.5 years this case has been pending, have you found any evidence of a demand for payment that was made to Friends of Brian Stewart by Strategy Group for Media at all?
Again, some of the work is contained within that because Constant Content is who Strategy and Media was billing to. Constant Content that was then trying to collect from you.
No, the conversation that you described with Mr. Goldstein, he explicitly says that his demand for payment has nothing to do with radio, correct?
But this case is about two things now, right? Radio and mailer.
Well, let's just go back to the basic question. Anywhere in your 150 or how many odd pages here, do you have any actual evidence that Strategy Group for Media demanded payment directly to Friends of Brian Stewart ever?
No.
Thank you.
Relating to radio, I
You
think
have any
I think that they may or may not have been involved in the print media side. I don't know the answer to that question.
Do you have any evidence in your large packet showing that Friends of Brian Stewart approved an actual expenditure for radio ads?
Yes,
Where is it?
that you approved an expenditure for the production of a radio ad by participating in a radio ad's production. Remember, one of the line items on the invoice is the production of the radio ad was $1,100. The airing of the radio ad was $9,600. I would assume by you personally appearing in the radio ad, you had approved at least the production.
You understand there's a difference between producing a piece of campaign material and actually spending money to run it, correct?
I think both have costs, and both are reportable on a campaign finance report.
Have you ever heard the phrase, in the can, we're gonna have something in the can?
Why don't you define the term for me?
Are you aware that sometimes in campaigns, draft mailers, TV ads, B-roll footage, things will be produced that are not actually ever used in the campaign, in which they're not paid, they're not billed, they're not paid for?
I would seek to make clear what I'm aware of. So my wife is a professional artist. She has done many totally volunteer pieces of work for campaigns where she does media creation for them. Nobody ever pays her. She doesn't do it, she's a freelance art person. She's not working at somebody's company while she's getting paid, while she's doing that work. Total volunteer. In that case, when a volunteer does something that's no cost to the campaign, there's nothing to report because there was no cost. We are not talking about that situation here. In this situation, Strategy and Media had paid people making a campaign ad for you, billed $1,100 for just the production. Let's set aside the running of the ad, which it ran, okay? But they paid people for the production of that ad. If that bill was paid by a third party, that's a reportable campaign finance expense. Just like if my wife did advertising, created an ad for a candidate, she only does print stuff, but if she created an ad for a candidate and then a third party paid her for that, for having done that work, that candidate needs to report that. There's a difference between volunteer in the can and a paid person doing work. Clearly there were people paid because Strategy and Media had an $1,100 bill to Constant Content, who, as per Mr. Schweitzer's affidavit, that bill was paid. It was paid on behalf of your campaign by Constant Content, and you have been aware of that for over 2 years and taken no steps to clean up your campaign finance reports.
Do you have any evidence that Friends of Brian Stewart has shown, hey, here's how much you want to spend to run a radio ad, and the campaign said yes?
I don't even know that that's relevant, but I don't have any evidence of your internal campaign meetings.
Do you have any actual evidence of Friends of Brian Stewart being informed, hey, this radio ad is going to run?
I don't know how that's relevant to you participating in the production of an ad if I focus in on that. But again, how would I have to be aware of your internal campaign meetings and discussions with vendors?
Well, you could have subpoenaed Strategy Group. Do they have any proof, they give you any proof that they had sent a payment demand to Friends of Brian Stewart?
Strategy Group didn't think that they needed to send you the demand because they were a subcontractor to Constant Content.
Is that another
And
way of
their
saying
bill,
no?
let me finish my answer at least. Strategy and Media was a subcontractor to Constant Content, a corporation, which will come up later.
I'm going to object. He has any
And
basis to
Strategy and Media,
testify.
well, you keep asking me about Strategy and Media, so I want to clarify, why would Strategy and Media have done anything with you? Because they did the work, they built Constant Content, and they were paid. So they had no outstanding debt or obligation because Constant Content paid that bill on the behalf of your campaign.
Where do you believe this radio ad ran?
If I look at Exhibit, in my files, Exhibit H, which begins on page 60, the page number is cut off on page 60, so look for the H's cutting it off so it's easy to find if you get to the right page. So these are my evidence. One of my evidence that the radio ads ran is on page 65, which is the bill for the radio ads running. Page 65 and 66 is one bill, and page 69 and 70 and 69 is another bill. All downloadable from the FCC site, the actual invoices.
If I were to summarize, and you correct me if I'm wrong, if I can summarize these invoices, they seem to indicate that these are is a radio ad potentially allegedly running in Zanesville and Nelsonville, right?
No. There are parts of that in there, but the 2 pages that I just referred to, it's actually 3 pages, In my exhibits, page 65 at the bottom, 66, and 69, those are not the orders. The other pages before that are the orders. Those are actually the invoices for the radio it's running.
Are you aware of how many counties were in House District 78?
I'm not sure how that's relevant, but no.
If I represented to you that if there were 6 counties in Ohio 78, it's the largest district in the state of Ohio, do you have any evidence to refute that?
No, but why would it matter to this case?
Well, if a radio ad ran on country music radio on a tiny station in Zanesville, 2 hours from my house and my law office, isn't it possible that I wouldn't hear that ad?
Yes, it's possible that you want to hear that ad, but I'm not sure why that's relevant. Once you became aware that the ad did run, you had an obligation to report it. As probably an in-kind contribution, given that a third party had paid the bill for the ads.
Am I understanding your argument today that even if the committee is unaware that an in-kind expenditure was made and has never given notice from any third party that an in-kind expenditure has been made, the committee breaks the law if they don't report that in-kind expenditure that they're unaware of?
Yes, and it's absurd that you're standing here saying this when you participated in the production of the radio ad. This is the kind of thing that I think citizens get sick of from politicians. This notion of, it's my voice in the radio ad, but I didn't know anything about it. And even when I found out about it, I, as a politician, didn't have to, I'm just the dumbest person on earth, and I don't have the right to do any investigation. I don't go to the FCC database. I don't clean up my finance reporting because I think I can get away with
Mr.
it.
Hicks, if you're giving a speech every time you ask a pretty basic question, we're going to be here a long time, okay? Have you run for election yourself?
Yes?
Okay. So let me understand this. If you're running next year for township trustee, and I come down to Claremont County, and I decide that I want to send out 25 pieces of mail that say, vote for Chris Hicks, paid for by friends of Brian Stewart, that'd be an in-kind contribution, right?
No, because if there was no involvement of the candidate within the activity, then it's not an in-kind contribution.
Mr. Hicks, that's...
So hold on a second. This is PAC law. I'll have to remember the laws exactly. But it's not called an unrelated expense, but it's, if somebody does an expense, or these ads you see from PACs, if it was a PAC and you were set up as a PAC, and it was not and the candidate had absolutely no involvement whatsoever, you see an ad on TV, then they don't have to report anything. But when the candidate becomes involved, did the radio voiceover, the mailers were approved by them, then it has to be reported as an in-kind contribution. So that would come down to the answer to your question would be, if you did it completely on your own, like if some person on a street in Claremont County just on their own sent out 50 things on my behalf and I had no involvement whatsoever, no knowledge or involvement whatsoever, there's a name for it. If it's just a person, it's not a PAC.
In-kind contribution.
No, it isn't. It's an independent expenditure. Correct, you said the right word. It's an independent expenditure, which is entirely different than an in-kind contribution. As soon as you become involved in the activity as a candidate, it is an in-kind contribution. If you have absolutely no involvement, then you can make the argument it's an independent expenditure, and that's when it's set up as a PAC to do that. So, Mr. Stewart, the point is, yes, for you to be involved and then 2 years later not have done anything to clean up your finance reports, that is a crime. That is illegal.
Yeah, we're going to agree to disagree on your discussion of campaign finance law here, but if I just decide to run those ads and I don't tell you about it, and you don't put it on your report, you'd be breaking the law then, under your own standard, right?
As I just said, I want to clarify again because you keep trying to put words in my mouth, and maybe there's a question there. It would depend on whether there was zero involvement or not, whether it was an independent expenditure that was done by just some person. If it's done by an individual, it's not technically called an independent expenditure then. But if it's done by a PAC, which you see all the time, ads on TV that are done by PACs where the candidate ostensibly has no involvement. By the way, there was a PAC involved with all this activity called Growth and Opportunity PAC. Anybody remember that name? That's where the PAC stuff was going on. And to this day, people like yourself claim that all that expenditure was a pure independent expenditure. And I have not raised any issues.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Madam Chair.
Yes, go right ahead.
Mr. Hicks, I want to make sure that we maintain the appropriate level of decorum here. You have provided an opening statement. You have then questioned yourself. Now you're under cross-examination. We don't want raising a voice. We don't want ad hominem attacks, like references to the word dumb, and we don't want testimony from that seat. you'll have more than adequate time. Now,
Just see this
now,
testimony.
listen, no, we don't want you to provide testimony beyond the cross-examination questions. If you're asked a question that you need to explain, you may explain. We don't need anything beyond that. You've been given ample time and will continue to have time to testify beyond the cross-examination. We'd like you to not raise your voice, to be professional and not refer to things like people being dumb, and to answer the questions that have been asked. If you need to provide a brief explanation based on the cross-examination, you may do that. Beyond that, we'd ask that you limit it to the questions that are being asked.
Thank you, Commissioner. I want to refer to the letter that it's in our packet as I think Exhibit 8, but I think it's in your packet if you recall, the letter from Brian Stewart to David Goldstein.
Do you know what page that is?
Well, I'm trying to do that, but it's
Page 32
32.
in my set.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Commissioner?
Representative Stewart, what page number is that in your packet?
It's Exhibit 8.
Exhibit 8.
Here's the back of it. He's correct, it's 32 in his packet, if that's easier for us. Thank you. Mr. Hicks, obviously you've seen this letter before, correct? Has Attorney Goldstein produced a copy of any letters that he claims to have sent to Friends of Brian Stewart?
Say that again, what's the question?
Has Attorney Goldstein produced to you any copies of the letters that he claims to have sent to Friends of Brian Stewart?
No.
Why not?
I don't know why not. He's not here to testify right now, so we can ask him that when he testifies.
Did you subpoena those documents that you asked him for them?
I believe in one of the matters, he was asked to bring the letters with him, and he claimed in one of the candidates that he had lost the original letter or couldn't locate it.
Okay. Did he indicate that to you with regard to Friends of Brian Stewart?
No, in fact, in the telephone conversation, he indicates looking at it while he's talking to me.
Well, where is it?
We'll have to ask Mr. Goldstein that when he appears.
Well, no, you had the opportunity to subpoena documents and get your case in order for today, and you didn't put that in your packet, right?
I guess I didn't, well, I can't put in my packet what I didn't have, but I took on faith that you wouldn't be arguing that your response to something, you would question the existence of the thing you were responding to.
Do you have any written proof of what the specifics were of the claim that he alleges he made to Friends of Brian Stewart?
I believe it was in one of my complaints, but I believe it was some 13,000, or he mentions the specific number in the telephone conversation with me. You might remember
Yeah.
13,000 something.
Great. I proposed last night that we stipulate the amount, and I think we can agree. You had a phone call. He said $13,000 some odd dollars for postage, mailers, and that was it, right?
When you say that was it, yeah, that his thing related to mailings, not to,
Didn't refer to radio ads.
Correct.
He just said postage, mailers, but no more specifics beyond that, right?
correct.
Okay. So has he produced to you a copy of a contract between Friends of Brian Stewart and Constant Content for anything?
No,
Why not?
I will have to ask him that. I can't read his mind.
Well, did you ask him for documents for your case?
No,
You didn't subpoena the guy that you think is a really important witness to give you documents that are relevant to this case?
I don't think the documents are particularly relevant to this case.
I'm sorry, Mr. Hicks, but you don't think that...
Let's take I-71 north.
You don't think that the actual payment demand that you claim was made to my committee is a relevant piece of evidence in your case?
No, because I believe that this case is not about that. It's about did activities take place that were paid that were not shown on a campaign finance report. This comes down to something very simple. Was the campaign finance report accurate or not accurate? And I believe there's more than sufficient evidence already that the campaign finance reports were not accurate and complete.
Okay, but if Friends of Brian Stewart has taken a position that David Goldstein's payment demand to us was bogus, and David Goldstein can't produce a contract or a payment...
I don't know.
Let me finish my question, please. If Friends of
I
Brian...
object to your characterization because I can also object.
Executive
that
Director.
David Goldstein can or can't produce things. I don't know whether he can or can't produce things. He will have to answer to whether he can or can't produce things.
If
Is that objection sustained?
Yes, go ahead.
if you as the complainant can't, let me rephrase. If Friends of Brian Stewart took the position that the payment demand by David Goldstein was bogus because there was no contract and no actual relationship there, which would authorize constant content to do things, isn't the existence of a contractor not pretty relevant to that case?
My answer to that question is no, primarily because, as I know from other cases relating to constant contact, no candidate had a written contract. No candidate involved with the Larry Householder team had any written, that I've encountered, they all maintained that there was no written contract and it was a verbal contract. So when you're on the stand, I can ask you, did you have a contract with Constant Content?
Sure you can, yeah. In September 5th, 2021, when Friends of Brian Stewart sent this letter to David Goldstein, Jeff Longstreth had been indicted for a bunch of federal felonies related to campaign finance, correct?
I don't know the dates of the indictments, but I'll take it that it was.
Just for the record, summer of 2020, Jeff Longstreth, Larry Householder, some other people got indicted for
I
racketeering.
think it was more later than
Let me
that.
finish. Yeah. Summer of 2020, Jeff Longstreth indicted for
Did you say
racketeering.
December? What was the wording?
Summer
Summer,
2020.
okay.
Yeah. Summer 2020, Jeff Longstreth is indicted for racketeering, money laundering, bribery, et cetera, right? Okay. So this payment demand is made more than a year after Mr. Longstreth had been indicted for money laundering, right?
Okay.
Yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay. Isn't it reasonable for a committee to be skeptical of a bill sent more than a year after the alleged debt was incurred by somebody who is hard up for money because they've been indicted by the feds?
I don't think it's reasonable to be skeptical when it relates to activities that candidates participated in. And I think that it is reasonable, if you ask me what was reasonable, I think it is reasonable that many candidates used the opportunity of those indictments to believe they had a get out of paying their bills card. And that money, by law, is still an obligation of the campaigns. It may be needed to be paid to law enforcement for recuperating the costs associated with the prosecution. But for example, not to go too long, apologies, but if I had a roofing contractor put a roof on and then they were indicted for some bunch of criminal activity, I still owe the money for the roof. That money would go to law enforcement then and the authorities as part of cost of the fray. I can't then say, well, because they got indicted, I don't owe the money anymore.
Mr. Hicks, on September 5th, 2021, Friends of Brian Stewart asked David Goldstein on behalf of Constant Content to provide a copy of the contract, provide some evidence of what this alleged debt referred to. If you have documentation, quote unquote, if you have documentation to the contrary, we would be glad to review it. Do you have any evidence in your packet of David Goldstein providing that documentation to Friends of Brian Stewart?
No, but I can't testify for David Goldstein. I subpoenaed David Goldstein to be a witness here and wish to examine him and cross-examine him, and he will be the person to ask those questions to.
But just so I'm tracking, in 2.5 years, you didn't subpoena documents from David Goldstein relevant to this case?
Asked and answered.
Oh, okay. Mr. Hicks, if you run for township trustee next year and you get a bill from me that says you owe Friends of Brian Stewart $13,000, are you going to pay that, no questions asked?
No.
Okay, why not?
I think that answering hypotheticals, I'm not inclined to do, is a hypothetical situation. That's not what the point is here. If you sent me a bill for activities I had been involved with, I might not, even then, I might not outright pay it, but I would certainly have proper diligence to figure out what I really owed and what had really happened, because it wouldn't just be an out-of-the-blue bill that somebody sent me in my mail if I never heard of. I'm getting a bill involved with something that I know there were things that took place because I personally participated in them, like mailers or radio ad.
You would require the person demanding money of you to prove that they actually are entitled to it, right?
I think I would do an investigation. I fail to see that this letter, I guess you're making a representation indirectly here, that this letter was your attempt to do an investigation, but I would say more that the letter was an attempt to wash your hands of it.
Your investigation would include asking the person demanding money of you to actually prove they're entitled to it, show us documents, right?
Yes.
Okay. And if the person demanding money fails to give you those documents as a response to your investigation, you probably wouldn't pay the money, right?
I guess I don't get the question because you actually have the documents. The documents are Exhibit D. And that you provided them. So you provided the documents to me that are a question of the particular mailers involved with the campaign that were done under your name. So you have them. David Goldstein didn't provide me those mailers, you did.
Well, actually, Mr. Hicks, do you recall your discovery request just said, send me everything that you sent and received during the 2020 campaign?
I don't remember what my discovery request said.
It was pretty broad. You asked for everything, drafts.
Again, I instant answered.
Well, I don't know that you have. Your request just asked for, it wasn't limited to just mail that was sent. You asked for drafts, you asked for
I know, I
emails.
believe this is like that I said I wasn't going to call Nelson Embry. If you want to produce a document and show what I actually asked for, but I can't sit here and remember what was in a discovery document, and I don't think it was as broad as you're characterizing.
Okay, so you've picked one draft mailer out of a great big stack I gave you that included that in your exhibit packet. Do you have anybody coming in today to authenticate that they actually received that mailer?
So, no.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any evidence elsewhere in your packet that would authenticate or prove that that draft piece of mail actually was mailed out in that format?
I think it proves that somebody made it for you.
Okay.
Whether it was mailed or not, my belief is it was mailed, but that is my belief. Then, and that which you're rightfully point out, I don't have somebody going to come in and testify to that belief, but it's not just a belief, it's a fact that somebody made those mailers for you.
So if I testify that that's a draft and there were many drafts and things get changed and it's not clear exactly what went out and that the disclaimer was changed, do you have anybody coming in that would be able to refute that or any evidence that would
This
contradict
is a
that?
hypothetical question that I don't even know what the question is.
I'm asking if you have any evidence or any witnesses who are going to come in and actually testify about what mail was actually sent or received.
But you just asked it, your question before this was different than what you just asked. So you're kind of changing the questions on the fly, and I already asked and answered the question that you just asked,
You
right
have-
now.
You have no proof of what mailers
So
were
ask the
or
third
were
time.
not sent. We haven't answered it yet, so I'm trying to answer it.
I've answered it, I think I can't answer it more times. No, I don't have somebody coming in to testify they received the mailer.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I have facts based on what you gave me that the mailers were created. And that's what I have. I think that alone shows that you were involved with and aware of things that were never reported on your campaign finance reports.
And just to be clear, I'm referring to page 47 of the complainant's exhibit packet where we've picked a mailer. Just going a few pages ahead in your packet, sir. If you go to,
Was there a question about page 47?
I was correct for the record indicating what exhibit you're referring to in the last line of questioning. If you go to page 51,
That's one of the mailers.
at the top of this draft mailer, can you identify what the disclaimer says?
Paid for by Citizens for Stewart.
Okay, that's wrong, right?
Okay.
And Citizens for Stewart is not the committee name, right?
Okay, well, I don't know if it ever was the committee name.
Okay, so if I represented you that that's a draft and before it went out it was changed, do you have any evidence that would contradict that?
No, but I also have no evidence
Thank you.
that it's on any report anywhere.
I'd like to go to page 86 of your packet.
Campaign finance report?
Yes, sir. Mr. Hicks, I'm going to represent to you that this is the 2019 annual report of Friends of Brian Stewart. Does that appear to be accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And at the very bottom of page 86,
86, okay.
there is a identification of expenditure to Old Trail Printing. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. What does it say that's for?
Campaign literature?
Do you have any evidence to prove what that expenditure was or was not for?
No.
So if in my testimony I testify that that's paying for exactly the literature that you say we didn't pay for, didn't report, do you have any evidence that would refute that?
I believe that expenditure you're recording there says 10/31/2019. So I would maintain that the mailers that were done in February and March, when the campaign was actually going on, you probably didn't do in October of 2013. I'm sorry, in October of 2019.
Do you have any evidence of what that expenditure to Old Trail Printing was for?
No.
Did you subpoena Old Trail Printing to determine what that was for?
No.
Okay. So when you claim that the campaign didn't pay for any literature, there's an example of paying for literature, right?
First off, it doesn't say mailers. The time frame doesn't make any sense, but if we want to go on the argument, Mr. Stewart, that in October of 2019 you got literature made for February and March mailers, then that can be your representation, and I'll question you on that later.
Apologies, folks, we got some exhibits out of order. 1 second. I'd like to go to page 57 of your exhibits, Mr. Hicks. Can you identify this document?
I believe it's let's see where it's part of it. Yeah, it was provided by Scott Schweitzer, the Chief Operating Officer of Strategy and Media. His work is an invoice for work that was done for your campaign.
This is an invoice for the radio ad you allege was run relating to Friends of Brian Stewart, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
I allege and Scott Schweitzer from Strategic Media alleges.
Who does it say on this invoice that it was billed to?
Constant content.
Okay. Do you have any corresponding invoice from Constant Content to Friends of Brian Stewart related to this radio ad?
No.
Okay, thank you. Do you know who stamped this paid?
I assume it's,
I didn't ask if you assume, I said, do you have any?
well, then I don't know because
Okay.
because you're asking me to make representations about somebody else's invoice.
Okay. Let's go to page 63 of your exhibit packet. You read the top line of this document.
candidate advertisement agreement form?
Do you know what this document is?
Yes, I believe so.
What do you think it is?
It's a required statement. I'm a layperson, so I apologize if I don't get it perfectly. But when political advertising is placed, there's a required form that needs to be submitted relating to who authorized and who's paying for the particular advertising that's taking place.
Okay, so the bottom left-hand corner of this agreement form, who does it say is the candidate and committee agency?
Well, on the authorized committee up above on the second line, it says Friends of Brian Stewart. And then the agency, which is what that is A. Grant Fink, which is an employee of Strategy Media.
How do you know that? How do you know that?
Because it's come up in other hearings.
Okay, is anybody gonna come in and testify who A. Brant Fink is?
Scott Schweitzer,
Okay.
who submitted these with this, so he didn't submit these, but we submitted the invoices.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna testify, I've never heard of this person, but we can come back to that later. Can we agree, though, it doesn't say Brian Stewart, it doesn't say Nelson Embry, right?
We can agree that it doesn't, but it also has a checkbox that the committee, the checkbox under undersigned represents that.
Okay. Do you have any evidence from Strategy Group for Media indicating that they sent any kind of similar form to either Brian Stewart or Nelson Embry prior to this radio ad form being filled out?
What's the question again? I'm confused.
Do you have any documentation between Strategy Group for Media and Friends of Brian Stewart prior to this ad form being filled out?
I have no, we can shorten this up a lot by, I have the information that's in my exhibits. So you keep asking me about information, do I have this, do I have that? I have the information that's in my exhibits.
Well, Mr. Hicks, that's how hearings work. I mean, you don't have a lot of evidence that you would otherwise seem to need to prove your case, so we're going to go through that, okay? Is there any documentation the Strategy Group for Media has given you between that firm and Friends of Brian Stewart at all?
I think that the documentation, no. But you've asked this question like 4 times now, I think. I have the documentation that's in my exhibits.
Okay. Did you subpoena Strategy Group for Media to provide you with any contracts or communications between them and Friends of Brian Stewart that relate to this radio ad?
I have the documentation that's in my exhibits, including an affidavit from Scott Schweitzer relating to the activities around the radio ad. I thought that was sufficient, and I think we could shorten this up a lot if you would focus on not these fishing
I'm going to
expeditions.
present my case, and I'm not going to interfere with the way you present yours, okay? The question was, because you didn't answer it there, was did you subpoena Strategy Group for Media
No.
for any documentation that they might have, allegedly, between their
Well, I guess
firm? Let me finish my question, please, sir. Any documentation from Strategy Group for Media to Friends of Brian Stewart relating to this radio ad? Did you ask them for it?
I asked them for what had happened, and they produced an affidavit and the materials that are in the binder.
Okay.
I feel like they responded superbly to what I requested.
Okay. So did you take that response to mean that no other documents exist?
I didn't think it necessarily matters if other documents exist, because I already have the evidence of what took place.
If Strategy Group for Media was running around placing orders for my campaign committee without me approving it, you don't think that's relevant to your claims?
I just find it hard to answer because we already have a radio ad where you participated in the production of the ad. You have the mailers, so I think that's the documentation that I need. So, but the answer to your question, I guess, is no.
I think it's going to be easiest if we refer to Respondent's Exhibit, which would be Exhibit 2, the pre-primary report of Friends of Brian Stewart.
What time period is this?
This is the pre-primary campaign finance report.
Give a page, Councilman.
Please don't have
It's,
paper.
it's in respondents' packet, Commissioner. And it would be exhibit 2, I think it's probably about 20 pages in there.
So in mine, it's page number,
At least a page start.
in mine, it's page number 97.
28.
The number of pages, the same thing. Yeah.
Well, just to make, we're all looking at exhibit 2 of Mr. Stewart's exhibits. The first page is 27 pages, it's found on the next page.
Thanks, Commissioner. Are we all relatively close if we go forward? Okay. Mr. Hicks, I'd ask you to go to page 4, Respondents Exhibit 2. You see in the middle where you have two 31J1 entries,
Yes,
and can we agree that a 31J1 entry is an in-kind expenditure?
I have no idea what this number means.
Okay. If I represented you that those are the Ohio Republican Party reporting in-kind contributions to Friends of Brian Stewart for printing and postage, do you have any evidence to refute that?
No.
Mr. Hicks, do you have any evidence to prove that these in-kind expenditures by the ORP for printing and postage reported by our committee were not for the exact mailers that you identified?
Yes,
What is that?
that somebody was making a request for payment for you from this because Constant Content had paid the bill. So the reason why Constant Content was making a request from you is because they are the ones who paid the bill. You may dispute that request, but they were trying to collect from you because they had already paid the bill to the vendors who did the work or their own
I'm going to
employees.
object to the witness testifying for an out-of-court witness who's not here.
Just, go, okay, understood.
I don't know what I testified.
I'd like to go to Respondents Exhibit 3, which is the 2020 post-primary report, please.
That's page 105 in the set that I have.
Well, I don't want to have different cross-references here because
It's on page 36 in the respondents' exhibits.
Are you there, Mr. Hicks?
Yeah.
Okay. If we go to page 2, there's two entries at the bottom of the page, both of them a 31J1 entry by the Ohio Republican Party. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And then on the subsequent page, page 3 of the report, Respondents Exhibit 3, you then have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more entries.
Mr. Stewart, if
Yes,
I
sir.
may, I'm sorry.
Stewart Exhibit 3, page 2, and the third exhibit is marked with a stamp on the bottom right. Exhibit 3, page 2. Exhibit 2 has 8 pages.
Right.
4 page 105 in the set that I
Wait a
have.
minute, 'cause I want to
Sure.
follow. I'm sorry, it's 3 page,
Exhibit 3, page
3 page 2. All right, I have.
2. The bottom 2 entries he's referring to.
Thank you. Okay. Okay.
All relatively close? Okay, thank you. So again, just for our record, I'm looking at Respondents Exhibit 3, page 3, and I'm representing to you, Mr. Hicks, that there are 6 more entries on this page where the Ohio Republican Party is reporting an in-kind expenditure. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And we agree that all of those entries are listed for printing and postage.
Yeah.
Do you have any evidence to prove that the in-kind expenditures by ORP for printing and mailing that were reported here by Friends of Brian Stewart were not for the exact mailers that you're talking about?
I believe I do, yes. Because Constant Content sought payment for you for those mailers that it had paid vendors or personnel to create. I think that's evidence that these are not them.
So, because Jeff Longstreth, who had just pled guilty to a bunch of federal felonies related to campaigns, because he says he's owed money, that trumps the Ohio Republican Party's report and my report.
You're wanting to make some sort of representation with the Ohio Republican Party's report. We're not looking at the report. We don't have somebody here from the Ohio Republican Party to testify as to what was in or out of the report. So I find that what you're saying is wanting to create some assumption that you don't have any evidence for.
Well, Friends of Brian Stewart's reports indicate in-kind contributions by the Ohio Republican Party, correct?
Yes.
I'll testify to this later, but that suggests that we believe the Ohio Republican Party made these in-kind expenditures, correct?
I'm not disputing whether the Ohio Republican Party made these in-kind expenditures.
And you have no evidence that indicates what specific mailers were or were not covered by all of these 8 entries, right?
I believe I have evidence from what you've provided that those printing and postage expenses were all tied to mailers that were clearly labeled from the beginning as paid for by the Ohio Republican Party. Even in draft versions, things being made by the Ohio Republican Party, they don't put down other paid for buys on their materials and then later change them.
Take just one moment, commissioners, to consult. No further questions for this witness at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Pickard, you want to come back?
I'm willing, yeah,
Okay.
I'm glad to come back. And I want to call Megan Fitzmartin. So she can speak.
If you be sworn.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Does she have a copy of your exhibits?
Right here.
Mr. Hicks.
Yeah, we have one for the witness here.
I got one, I just gave it, I have.
Okay.
Thank you for being here again, Ms. Fitzmartin. Did you, during the 2020 campaign, what was your, just because there's a lot of new commissioners, I apologize, but could you describe what your role was on the 2020 campaign as it related to Larry Householder?
I ran a number of House candidates and supported their efforts to win election.
And were you an employee of the Ohio Republican Party?
I was not.
Were you an employee of Constant Content?
I was not.
Were you an employee of JPL and Associates?
I was not.
I would say that contradicts your prior testimony.
That is not accurate. I was a contractor,
Okay,
as we have talked about multiple times.
so let me restate my question, I apologize. Were you a 1099 contractor for the
Yes.
Ohio Republican Party?
No, I was not with the Ohio
So
Republican
you did no
Party.
work for the Ohio Republican Party?
I worked for the Ohio House Republican Caucus.
Okay. So just since you brought it up, the Ohio House Republican Caucus, you were a 1099 employee of the, 1099 of the Ohio Republican
I
Caucus.
did work to support the Ohio House Republican Caucus.
Did that work relate to individual candidate activities like mailers and advertising or different?
Yep.
Okay.
Typical campaign work.
Were you at 1099 of Constant Content?
Yes.
Were you at 1099 of JPL and Associates?
Yes.
Okay. And just for clarification, because I jumped when I was using the word employee incorrectly, and I threw in JPL and Associates, or just for purposes of the commissioners that might not have been, what's the difference, what's the relationship or connection between JPL and Associates and Constant Content?
And there are two entities that certainly had a number of clients that were similar.
Who was the principal of each entity?
JPL and Associates was Jeff Monstraff. You'd have to look up for Constant Content.
If I represented to you that Jeff Longstreth was the principal for Constant Content? As
Never saw
found in
any
his
filings.
indictments?
Never saw any filings, so I'm sure you could look at the Secretary of State's website.
Okay. So who did you take direction from Constant Content?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
You said you were a 1099 employee of Constant Content.
I never said I was an employee.
I'm sorry, a 1099 contractor for Constant Content. Who did you take direction from?
I worked with Jeff Monstraff.
Okay. From who else from Constant Content provided you what I would describe as toss-down direction? Not a
I'm not
colleague.
familiar with that phrase.
Like, was Jeff, is it related to Constant Content, was Jeff Longstreth your boss?
I mean, again, I worked with him.
So if he wasn't your boss, who was?
Well, as a contractor, I actually was the principal of my own company, and so I was my own boss.
So you were paid as Megan Fitzmartin or paid as some other company?
MC Fitzmartin LLC.
Okay. In the stack of exhibits that is the respondent's exhibits, so the one that has that exhibit 1 at the bottom, he has included a set of mailers.
Madam Chair,
He being who, sorry.
The respondent.
1 second, let's go.
where are we at in the packet from the respondent?
I'm going to point that out here.
Exhibit 9, about 2 years of the way back.
You look for the mailers. Did you, well, let's stay on that for a second, but a question leading up to that is, did you work on any mailers related to Brian Stewart's campaign?
I did.
Did you do so on behalf of the Ohio Republican Party?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I mean, I guess they were on behalf of Brian Stewart, for state representative.
Okay. Did you work on, and maybe Mr. Stewart can help me point one out. Okay, so if I look at, there's some of these in here, but since they're not page numbered, but let me see if I can identify. I don't see numbers in there.
There's a base and number on the bottom right. It's a bunch of
Oh,
zeros.
they're
and a number.
hidden in the, hold on. Thank you. Got to reorient mine. Okay, so, for example, on page where it says 17 on the corner, I'm just using this as an example. You see that? So it says at the top, paid for by the Ohio Republican Party. Do you agree with that?
That is what I see.
Did you create this mailer?
Well, I don't design. I wish I could.
Okay, were you involved with the production, creation, messaging for this mailer?
Yes.
On what, whose behalf then?
To assist with Brian Stewart winning his state representative campaign.
So you were doing that as an employee of JPL and Associates or Constant Content?
Again, not an employee, sir.
I'm sorry, I will try to be better at using the term correctly. As a contractor.
Well, you also contract, so I think you can appreciate the distinction. I certainly was working still with Jeff Monstraff, yes.
So these mailers that say Ohio Republican Party, actually your answer surprised me, so that's why these mailers that say Ohio Republican Party, you had a role in that as an employee of, I'm going to try to do better, as a contractor of Constant Content and JPL?
Yes, so vendors still work vendors will work with campaigns and the Ohio Republican Party or whomever.
Okay, and I don't mean this as I'm not meaning this in a legalistic way, but you're saying in essence there was some coordination between Constant Content and JPL and the Ohio Republican Party in the purposes of these mailers.
I don't feel comfortable answering the term coordination.
Collaboration, I'm using a non-legalistic term.
Yes,
So there was a collaboration between the Ohio Republican Party and Constant Content and JPL on these mailers.
yes.
Okay. If you look at in my exhibit pack, which is the other bundle, and exhibit D, exhibit D,
Page number.
oh, I'm sorry. It's the one that would be 47, but the page number is kind of hidden by the mailer. It would be page 47.
Say D.
D, it was D.
D is in dog?
D, yes. But if you look at the page number, it's 47. Were you involved in the creation of these mailers?
Yes.
Did, in that, as you were creating them, did you have contact with Brian Stewart?
I presume, but I don't recall. This was over 4 years ago.
Okay, what about Nelson Embry?
No.
Okay. Did, when these are labeled paid for by Friends of Brian Stewart, was that an error on your part in the creation of these? Or was there a distinction between things paid for by Brian Stewart versus the Ohio Republican Party?
I don't recall.
You don't recall? Did Constant Content, as an organization, did it support candidates, a broad range of candidates, of which one was Brian Stewart, in the 2020 primary?
I mean, a company worked with candidates, yes.
Okay, but specifically candidates that had been sanctioned by House Speaker Larry Householder?
I'm not familiar with the term sanctioned. That's not really used.
Okay, endorsed by the House Republican Caucus / whatever the name of it was at the time, / Larry Householder?
I mean, I don't recall that he was,
What did you
Representative
work
Stewart
with?
was endorsed by the caucus. I do recall that he was endorsed by Larry Householder.
Okay. Did you know that it was stated while you were sitting here that, for example, Gene Schmidt and Alan Freeman were not endorsed by the Ohio Republican Party? Were you aware of that?
Very aware.
Okay. And Brian Stewart was endorsed by the Ohio Republican Party,
Yes.
correct? Okay. In these mailers, you were involved in producing or supervising, and they're labeled as paid for by the Friends of Brian Stewart, is that correct?
That's what I see right here. Yes.
Okay. By the way, did you work as a contractor for JPL or Constant Content? Did you work with any candidates that were not endorsed by Larry Householder?
Yes.
Who?
I mean,
For the 2020 House Republican primary, if I wasn't specific enough.
well then, no.
Okay, okay, when I add the clarity that I'm talking about that matters at hand, the 2020 House Republican primary, the only candidates you worked with were Larry Householder endorsed candidates.
As the Speaker of the House, yes, which is very common in the caucus setting.
Okay. Are you familiar with Scott Schweitzer?
I am.
Did you work with Scott Schweitzer?
No.
Okay, so on behalf of Constant Content and/or JPL and Associates?
On behalf of candidates, yes.
So I believe in his affidavit, and he'll testify later, that he believed he was working with Constant Content.
Okay.
So were you working with Scott Schweitzer and Strategic Strategy and Media as...
Strategy and Media is in the company.
Strategy Group for Media Incorporated and Strategic Media Placement. Are those companies?
They are.
Okay. Did you work with those companies?
I did.
Did you work with Scott Schweitzer?
I did.
Did you work on mailers with Scott Schweitzer
No.
or those companies? Did you work on media, things like television and radio?
Yes.
Did you work with Scott Schweitzer on the ad battle tested for Brian Stewart?
I do not recall that specific ad until it was displayed earlier today, but I'm sure I did.
You're sure that you did, okay. Did you do so on behalf of the Ohio Republican Party?
I would not characterize my efforts as that, no.
Okay. Did you do so on behalf of, then who instructed you or gave you direction to work with Constant Content, to work with Strategy Group for Media and Strategic Media Placement on a radio ad for Brian Stewart?
I don't recall who gave me specific instruction.
When you did so for other candidates or in general, where would that approval come from? Where would that instruction come from? For example, Jeff Longstreth, candidate just called you up.
I mean, it depends on what the issue at hand was. It's not just one person. So it's very difficult to answer, especially over 4 years later.
When you did mailers that were associated with the Ohio Republican Party that you said you were involved with, when you were involved with mailers on behalf of the Ohio Republican Party,
I would argue that it's not on behalf of, that's just the disclaimer that's used.
okay, when you worked on mailers with the disclaimer Ohio Republican Party, who approved those?
I don't recall.
Did anybody in the Ohio Republican Party approve them?
I don't recall.
Okay, when you worked on, did the candidate approve them?
I would certainly talk with candidates, but I cannot confirm that they would approve every single thing that went out.
Would you agree that in a prior hearing, it appeared that it was related to Alan Freeman, who was not endorsed by the Ohio Republican Party, so I want to make that clear, that you and he were intimately involved with approving all those creative mail pieces in text messaging and emails and so forth?
We certainly communicated a lot, yes.
Did he, in that case, did he approve those mailers?
I'm sorry, how does this pertain to the matter?
Well, because I'm going to get to the question of whether Brian Stewart approved these mailers. And you expressed that you were unclear on what the approval was. And I'm just pointing out that there's a approval process that was clear in another case of how you were involved in
It's a different
approval.
case.
I just want to put it
Let's
there.
deal
It's a
with this.
different case.
Okay.
Let's deal with this.
Who approved these mailers that are on page, Exhibit D in my binder, which starts on page 47. Did Brian Stewart approve these mailers?
I would have to go back and look and see if he approved. I do not feel comfortable saying carte blanche, he approved every mailer.
Was it your normal practice, and have you previously testified that you always had the candidate approve mailers?
Typically, the candidate does approve a mailer. And
Okay.
as I said prior, I also hesitate by saying 100%. That is exactly what happened.
Did you work on radio ads for other candidates than Brian Stewart?
I did.
Were any of those radio ads, or maybe could you characterize those radio ads as to that they had disclaimers of Ohio Republican Party versus disclaimers of the candidate? Whether they were all candidate, they were mixed? Can you just
I hope they're all
characterize what
candidate
kind of?
Because candidates get better rates, but I don't know. I cannot confirm that all of them are paid for by the candidate.
Okay. But you were involved with the creation of the ad ballot test, to your recollection. You believe, for your recollection, you were.
Yep.
Okay. And the disclaimer at that end of the ad, you heard it while you were sitting here, was that not Brian Stewart speaking?
Correct, because for radio spots to have candidate rates, the candidate's voice has to appear on the radio ad.
So you were under the impression then, when that ad was being created, that it was being paid for by the candidate? Thus, the disclaimer, paid for by Friends of Brian Stewart?
Yep.
Okay. And were you involved in were you aware of those, of an ad buy being placed for those ads?
I'm sure I was at the time, but I don't recall sitting here today.
Okay. So when it's, I think, you know, it's clear that whether they did so authorized or what have you, strategy, SMP, the Scotch Schweitzer Organization, Strategy of Media or Strategy Group for Media, I don't want to say the wrong company name, that there was an ad placed there. Were you aware of them ever placing ads without authorization from somebody? Did you ever have that
I cannot
experience?
speak for them, so. I don't
Were you
know the
involved
answer
with
right now.
the request going to Strategy and Media to actually place ads, not just produce them, but to place them?
I don't recall, sorry, I've done hundreds of campaigns, so this has been quite some time.
Okay, so okay, so you don't recall whether Strategy and Media placed ads without authorization during that period? Okay. Have you heard of David Goldstein?
I have.
And how have you heard of David Goldstein?
I mean, I met him, I guess, one of the previous meetings that I was here, up on 19. So
Okay.
that's how I came across.
Okay, but other than in a commission hearing, you've had no knowledge or interaction with David Goldstein?
No, sir.
Since the 2020 election,
Which one?
primary,
Okay.
okay, have you had, since the indictment of Jeff Longstreth, have you had ongoing engagement in any way with Jeff Longstreth?
No.
Okay. Okay, I don't think I have any questions, but I don't excuse the witness.
Good after.
I know, it's tough.
How you doing today? My name's Brian Garvine. How are you?
Hi, sir. I'm fine. How are you?
Co-counsel Brian Stewart. Doing well. I'm gonna try to be quick.
I appreciate that.
No problem. Figured you would. So, we've never met before today, is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
All right. And you can call me Brian. In fact, you want me to call you Meg or Miss Fitzmark?
Megan's fine.
Meg, all right. Feel free to call me Brian. So just a little bit of background. So in 2020, you were an independent contractor for a few outfits that you already named. You were working on several campaigns, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And are you familiar with the concept, the in-the-can concept?
Yes.
Okay. My understanding of it is that candidates will, and I know this myself, that drafts, there'll be drafts of mailers and drafts of commercials and drafts of radio ads that are formulated, but they're never actually used. Is that correct?
Yes. You have to be prepared for everything.
Right. It's common to do that. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And it's common to do that well before a primary or general election, correct?
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, is it your understanding that the thinking is we're going to put them in the can, we're going to film them, and we're going to do the full commercial, whether it's radio, commercial, whatever, we're going to do it, and then we're going to kind of get a feel for whether or not we actually need to do it through polling and things like that. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
And then if the polling's close, then let's do it. And then if it's not, then we don't.
Mhm.
Is that fair?
Yes.
All right. And were you familiar at all, and you may not even recall, were you familiar with Brian Stewart's district in 2020, District 78?
Yes.
Is it a large district?
very large.
Okay, it was the
It was
largest,
very unfortunate for him, a lot of travel.
several counties,
Yes.
largest one in the state.
Yes.
Is that correct? And would
At
it
the
be?
time, yes, I don't, probably not even, but yes.
Right, then,
Yes.
all right. And so would it be reasonable that if an ad ran in let's say Zanesville or something like that, that Brian Stewart, a radio, he would have no idea?
That certainly could be the case.
All right. And then in terms of mail piece, mailers and so forth, is it typical to have a lot of drafts?
Indeed,
Okay.
much to the designer's chagrin.
Right, exactly. And those things could say, paid for by friends of Brian Stewart, could say paid for by Ohio Republican Party. They could be drafts that never go out. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And as you sit here today, I assume you don't have a recollection of which mailers went out and which ones didn't. Is that correct?
I wish I did, but I do not.
Right. Like if I showed you every mailer in Exhibit 9 and then Exhibit D, you wouldn't be able to tell me what went out and what was just a draft, right?
No,
All right.
not sitting here today.
And was it your understanding that Brian Stewart, for the 2020 primary in general, that he was endorsed by the Republican Party?
Yes.
And part of the significance of that is when you're endorsed by the party, that they will send out mailers at a significantly discounted rate than your own campaign, correct?
Yes.
So it makes more sense financially to do that. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
In fact, it's not even close. Right? I mean, you're gonna pay like at least double
Yes.
or thereabouts.
Yes, it's based on the bulk rate for postage.
Okay. And then have you ever seen, related to the 2020 primary or general election, have you ever seen any of Brian Stewart's campaign finance reports?
No.
Okay. So if I showed them to you today and I showed some entries, you wouldn't know what they were for or what they weren't in terms of Jane County. You wouldn't.
Simply the itemized, what
Right.
the report demonstrates,
But you wouldn't know what they are.
not necessarily.
Okay, all right. And do you have a specific recollection of ever talking to Brian Stewart about a radio ad or a mail piece that he approved versus one that he didn't approve, or in any really way, shape, or form?
No, I know we certainly have discussions and making sure, part of my job was to make sure what was sent out or what, was designed was true to him. And so we talked about that, but I don't have certainly any recollection, again, over 4 years
Right.
ago, very specific conversations.
And how many campaigns were you working on in 2020 in the general and primary?
There were 63 Republican city members. Probably we filed in 93 seats, so 100.
Okay, so between the general, you're working on, you were doing some work on behalf of.
Again, different, varying degrees, because
Sure.
obviously contested matters, but
Right.
you still feel the call no matter what.
Right. You were doing some work to some level, to varying degrees for about 100 different candidates. Is that fair?
Yes.
Through those 2 cycles. All right. And then even if a candidate approves a radio ad or a mailer or anything, doesn't necessarily mean that it goes out, correct? It could stay quote unquote in the can, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So approval doesn't necessarily mean that, I can approve the look of it
Yeah,
and what it says, but it may not go out.
correct,
And I may not know if it goes out, correct?
correct.
Okay. I being a candidate, not me personally.
Yes, understood.
And you don't know which, for Brian Stewart's campaign, you don't know, and actually for the designation of Friends of Brian Stewart campaign, you don't know that any of those mailers actually went out, correct? Like everything that we see here, that we've seen here, that says Friends of Brian Stewart, they could have been drafted and never went out, right?
Yes, I would hope some mail went out, but I cannot tell you which did or did not.
Right.
Correct.
Well, stated a different way, what could have happened, and what makes more sense financially, as we just talked about, is if a mailer says Friends of Brian Stewart, intuitively, it's more likely
I'm
that
gonna
it's.
object because I don't know what he's representing intuitively, could have happened this way. Is there an actual question that's based on something tangible or just?
Why haven't you asked me?
We need to hear the question.
Well, I'm objecting to the fact that he's making all these hypothetical, how things, assumptions.
Well, it's not in the sense that this is based on her experience.
Then
So the
I
question is-
testify to her experience, not you put words into her mouth about her experience.
Well, I'm not, I'm asking her a
We'll make
question.
the
If she doesn't-
determination, excuse me, Counselor, we'll make the determination as to the propriety of the questions. If you have an objection, you can raise it. We first need to hear the question before we can rule on the objection.
Just as a point of order here, normally in these hearings, there's a determination of who is the person that rules on objections. I've made objections, Mr. Kirschner, you've repeatedly interjected at that point. Are you the person ruling on objections?
As a matter of fact, the executive director will provide decisions on objections. I have not ruled on any objections. I have not spoken on any objections. What I have done is pointed out decorum and professionalism in hearing. For Mr. Richter to be able to respond to a question or an objection, we need to first hear the question. That's what we'll do. Mr. Richter will then make a determination as to the admissibility or propriety of the question.
So we'll rule at this point, yes.
But I also don't want to clarify, what he said is not correct. In the prior hearings, Mr. Richter, a member of the commission is designated as who will rule on objections. Typically, it's an independent member that, and it's clear who that member is that rules on objections. And then if I make an objection, they can say, whether it's sustained or not, and we move on. Without speeches from the commission members or, so who is the person that is ruling on objections during this hearing?
In the Freeman case, it was Mr. Norman. In the Schmidt case, it was me. Mr. Norman is no longer on the commission. I will be making those determinations.
So I would like it if I make an objection, you rule on the objection without speeches from any members of the commission.
The commission will do as it pleases as it relates to the ruling on objections. Our counsel will administer those rulings. Counsel, you may proceed.
Yeah, Mr.
Proceed,
Hicks,
Mr. Garland.
Mr. Hicks, the commissioners have a right to express their comments and/or questions. So we're going to allow Mr. Richter to rule on those objections, okay?
Okay?
So my question is, I'm gonna try to remember it now.
Yeah.
Based on your experience, would you agree with me that it would make more sense if a mailer said Friends of Brian Stewart, with Mr. Stewart being an endorsed candidate of the Ohio Republican Party, it would make more sense that that was initially a draft, but that the actual mailer that went out would have gone out by the Ohio Republican Party because it would have been literally a half the price. Does that make sense?
That could be fair, yes, it would make sense, but I can't
Right,
speak.
no, and I understand that, but I'm just saying, based on the
Yes.
fact that he was an endorsed candidate, to say no, it would almost be foolish to not have the Ohio Republican Party send it out, so it's gonna cost you at least twice as much. Is that fair?
Yes,
Okay. I mean, you could do it, but it wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense.
correct.
All right. All right. And are you aware of any documents between Constant Contact and, is it Strategy Group? I can't remember the name of it. Is it what is it?
The strategy group, and then they have a placement company, so it's, but yes, strategy group is the umbrella.
I was gonna say those groups. Are you aware of any communication, I haven't seen, are you aware of any communication between those groups and Mr. Stewart before he had any deadlines for his campaign finance reports or anything? Are you aware of any of that?
I am not.
Okay, that's all I have, thank you.
You look at it in the respondents packet, page, it's labeled 27. It's one of the mailers I was bringing over with it. And then in my packet, look at, it would be page, I think 49, but the number's cut off. It's the one that has a picture of Mr. Stewart and Donald Trump.
I'm sorry, what was your number?
I think if you go on, the last one where you can read, then the page number is 46. So it'll be page 49 if you just flip forward 3 pages. It's this one. So the bulk rate permit on the one that is page 27 in the respondents package, what does it say the bulk rate permit is?
Nonprofit or U.S. postage paid Ohio Republican Party.
And then if I look at the page I directed to you in my exhibits, what does that say though?
Actually, I'm sorry, I think I pulled up, it looks the same, but it's slightly different.
I don't think it looks the same, I'm just putting that one.
Again, I
Okay.
have the right one, but I don't believe I do, so I don't want to misspeak.
Well, so if you,
Page 49
Yeah,
is
page 40.
the respondent, or the complainant's materials. Okay, then go forward
I
about
just look
4
up this,
pages.
am I able to just look at the screen?
oh, yes, well, these are not my set, but I think it's that.
You think or you know? I just want to make sure.
I know.
don't want to respond incorrectly.
So that's,
Okay.
okay, good. Okay, so what's the permit say on that one?
First class mail, U.S. postage, paid Columbus, Ohio, permit 6871.
So in the design process, is it normal to have the permit that you're, a differing permit than what you're actually going to use in the future on the mailer?
As I've stated before, I'm not the designer, so I cannot speak to that.
Okay. You testified that you work with 100 candidates?
An estimation of quite a few.
Isn't it fair to say that in reality, in the 2020 campaign cycle, there were some much smaller number of candidates that were in contested races that you work with, like in the order of 20 to 25?
The 2020 campaign cycle would include both primary and general, so much more than 20.
I'm sorry, say that again.
The 2020 campaign cycle includes both the primary and the general election. We speak and reference it as a cycle, so many more than 20.
In the Ohio House races? Okay, so how many then do you think it was? I mean, no, it can't be 100 unless it was more than the number of reps in the,
As I said, it's nearly 100, and you've then taken it down to just Ohio House. And so between the primary and the general election, there are a number of contested races. So I think, upwards of 60 in terms of those that had opponents.
okay. You testified to, so I mentioned my wife's a professional artist when she's doing work where she's getting paid.
Yes, I've said that quite a few times.
You know, when you testified about revisions, and you were asked a lot of questions about, are there many revisions and in the can and things we didn't actually send out? If a person's being compensated for doing that work, doesn't that work need to be reported like work that went out?
I don't know.
Okay? So I take it at face value that you don't know. When you did that kind of work, and you said, was your representation that you didn't know for sure what went out, what did and didn't go out?
What I am sitting here before you saying is that I cannot, in August of 2024, tell you definitively what did or did not go out in March, somewhere between
Okay.
February and March of 2020. Again, I've worked on a number of campaigns in the interim, and I do not want to misrepresent any single thing that I've done.
So in the example, so did you in any way, did your pay differ based on things that were drafts and what went out and what didn't went out, or were you just paid?
I was paid on retainer, which I had testified before you.
So those things that were drafts and going and over and over again, or whatever the testimony was, those particular things, if you were just paid on a retainer, then you were paid for that work and coordinating those activities?
I do not appreciate the term coordination.
Substitute a term that you prefer to use.
I certainly worked on efforts to support candidates, yes.
Okay. And some of those efforts that, assuming it was valid, the in the can thing, some of those efforts, did you ever tell vendors downstream, or have any role in telling vendors downstream, like strategy and media, that, for example, we're not going to pay you for work that you've done because we're not actually going to use it? It's in the can.
I don't understand the question.
So I guess they brought up this distinction of you can have stuff in the can that never got sent out. And I'm bringing up the distinction, well, if people were paid for creating that stuff, it's still a campaign expense. And so I'm asking a clarifying question, if you ever told a downstream vendor that they were not going to be paid for something because it didn't actually go out.
I'm not familiar with the term downstream vendor, so I'm not sure I can answer that.
Okay, so somebody who is doing you testified that you weren't actually doing the creative work in Adobe products, for example. Somebody else was doing that work, okay?
Correct.
So were those designers only paid for work that went out?
I don't recall. I wasn't in charge of paying the designers. That was not my purview.
Did you hire the designers?
I did not.
Who hired the designers?
I don't recall.
Were they contractors to Constant Content and or JPL and Associates?
I would have no way of answering that.
Okay. All right, I have no further questions at this time, but I don't excuse the witness.
Do you have a follow-up?
Just a couple quick follow-ups, very quick. So Megan, on the comparison between the two.
Yes.
So one of them, I'll represent to you, and you can pull back out, but I'll represent to you that one says paid for by the Ohio Republican Party, and then that's got the mail notation, paid Ohio Republican Party. And then in the mailer that says paid for by Friends of Brian Stewart, that says permit 6871. You see that?
I do.
Do you know who owns permit 6871?
Presumably the mail shop.
Okay, but I mean, do you know who that's assigned to?
No, I'm off the top of my head.
Okay, do you know, if I told you that the campaign Friends of Brian Stewart does not have a permit number, do you have any reason to dispute that?
No, sir.
Could that permit number be assigned to the Ohio Republican Party?
I do not know the answer to that.
Okay. And then, in terms of the in the can, we talked about that, a little bit with Mr. Hicks. I think you said you're not familiar with how those services are paid for, correct?
Correct. That was not in my duties.
Okay. What could happen is there could be an arrangement with those companies to say that their payment will be for what's ultimately used, correct?
I object.
Okay.
This is what could happen. Should the witness have no knowledge as to what could happen?
I understand.
Pure speculation.
Overruled, go ahead. I mean, it's, okay, so her answers are indefinite. I mean,
She would
For
have
the
a
board to
specific
weigh in.
question about how other vendors perform. She has no basis to have an answer to that question. It's not a proper question for her.
Well, it is in the sense that she has a lot of experience and the board can weigh what she says for what it's worth or what it's not.
Is she an expert witness? And do we need to get to qualifiers for expert
Well,
witness on this?
you call
My
it,
point
first
is,
of all, I'm not-
she's not dead.
but I'm not
making a
asking-
very simple point. The question should be connected to the actual direct experience and knowledge of the witness, not asking them to speculate about how other entities operate, or could it be normal that this would happen?
Well, she has a tremendous amount of experience in this field, and if she has no knowledge, she can say she has no knowledge, or she can make an educated guess, and then it's up to the board how much
educated
weight
guess.
they put in. So my last question is just to clarify, in your experience, could the arrangement be that something to the effect of that the company that has made that commercial or radio ad or so forth would be paid on an as-used basis? Is that possible?
Having worked for a media firm since the campaigns that I worked for the Ohio House, yes, it is entirely possible that a firm can do work and not bill the client for it if it's not used.
Okay, that's all I have, thank you.
And my understanding is there any follow-up? No follow-up questions from Mr. Hicks?
Commission questions.
Commissioners, any questions of the witness? Go ahead, Mr. Knight.
So, and I think we're involved in billing, but, you will pay by constant content or GPL for this fraud campaign, right?
Yes, that's on, again,
On
that's on
retainer.
retainer,
On
yes,
retainer.
yes.
Okay, so whether the radio ad is played, mailer is sent, or in the can, you're getting paid the retainer, right? So, and I guess I'm asking you a campaign finance law question, which isn't fair, but doesn't that have to be somewhere accounted for within this construct? Right, your time, or your consultant, you're paid on retainer, the end client are the campaigns. You're working on these activities, doesn't somehow, either there's a direct payment for your time or an indirect in kind, one way or the other, unless I'm misunderstanding the dynamic.
Again, that's not my expertise,
Fair enough.
so I don't want to misspeak.
Fair enough.
I will say that doing caucus work, supporting, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, there are a lot of folks that are paid retainer or what have you that support everyone. And so, I guess I just asked the question. It doesn't appear on everyone's campaign finance report, so I don't think it's fair to single out this particular individual.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Any other questions?
I have a redirect based on this question.
Go ahead, Mr. Knight.
So I thought that was a very interesting question, because the question comes, your time, and I think I know the answer, but I just want to be clear. How was it rebilled or in kind of declines?
I don't know if that was my department.
You just testified that lots of times there's people working on campaigns in the kind of the manner you were, and they don't show up on all the reports. I think that was, they don't show up on people's reports. Was that you stand by that statement?
I would say throughout the course of time, yes.
Okay.
It is not particular to one
So-
individual or one campaign.
So if I characterize that what we're talking about here is this case where people who are endorsed, either by the speaker or the ORP, end up getting a bunch of compensated time spent on their campaigns that in many cases never shows up on any campaign report, wouldn't that be consistent with what you just said is, so a lot of times there's people that are getting
I
paid that are
certainly don't
working?
want to speak on behalf of those organizations, no.
Well, did you provide any by candidate billing to anybody?
As I testified on numerous occasions, I did not do any billing.
Okay. Did anybody ask you for an allocation of your time as to how it should be divided between candidates for which you were doing work for?
Not that I recall.
Did you ever provide any in-kind information to any candidate of what they should show as an in-kind on a report based on your compensation for working on their campaigns?
Not that I recall.
I'm just going to place it, I just think it's irrelevant. We've certainly gone past the parameters of the exact Mr. Hicks' complaint, but
I think my complaint is whether the report was complete and accurate and whether expenses or in-kinds that took place were reflected or not. So I think we've just had the witness testify that she's not aware of her time being rebilled or showing on a campaign finance report, which I think is extremely relevant to the direct allegation of the campaign finance reports were not complete or accurate, specific to the activities around radio and mailers.
Any other questions from commissioners? None. You can leave the witness seat at this point.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Mr. Hicks?
So I'm just going to ask now, I'd like to call Nelson Emery.
Madam Chair,
Yeah.
if I may.
Yes.
We've been going a little over 2 hours. Let me take a 5 minutes.
Yes, we can do a 5-minute, 10-minute? Okay, we'll do a 10-minute break, and we'll resume.
issue.
Just a housekeeping, housekeeping issue. We want me to raise it now. Would I be, I've got a little bit of time constraint this afternoon. Would I
We've
be,
got a couple numbers to do too.
okay,
What you do?
What's our hard out?
yeah. Because
I have to be on at 2:30.
2:30, okay.
Before that, so we might have to be over. I've got a 2:30,
Okay.
then I can get there in about 15 minutes,
Okay, so we need to meet at 2.
between 2 and 2:15.
Can I just procedurally, do we know if Scott Schweitzer here? I haven't seen him.
I do not know.
So he was a subpoena witness.
Yeah, we are on.
Because I'm getting out of the way, he's here.
I don't know. I haven't seen it.
When you say you have to be, does that mean the hearing's over? Or-
Yes.
Because
For
then
today,
we have another person who has to leave at 2:30. So between 2:15 and 2:30, we have two commissioners that have to leave.
Well, does it, I mean, since we have to reconvene, would it make sense to stop now and then figure out another date?
I'd rather get the testimony out of the way.
Yeah,
But if your
You've got
party
someone who's
already
provided
is
us,
here,
then we
What's
try
that?
to get as much of it out of the way as you
Yeah, no, that's, so,
can.
yeah, you want to, could we maybe?
I don't know, not that I'm aware, I haven't seen it, but it's sort of.
Let's try to figure that out. while
Yeah,
we're-
if you guys could figure that out
Yeah.
while we take.
But I think regardless, it's maybe potentially good till 2, it sounds like is.
Yeah,
Chris, I mean, what do you think you have?
let's take our 10-minute break.
Scott
We'll be back.
Schweitzer, David Goldstein. Huh? He's gonna be here next meeting.
Sure.
Scott Schweitzer, and I'm gonna try to call Nelson Emily because I think the first name. Well, then I'm gonna, he needs to be here next time. He was the treasurer. The treasurer is the one who has the obligations for the statute. He's the one, he's named in the complaint. He can take the fifth.
See you back past there, just.
Water or anything in here, is that all right?
I think it's fine.
Is there a vending machine place here?
There used to be right where we are, but,
But now it's
if
this
you-
room.
yeah, basically, there used to be a little cafe here years and years ago, but if you go out this main area, don't go into the tunnel, but you go through kind of the revolving doors, there might be a little kind of shop there on the right-hand side, sorry, I haven't served them
Yeah,
in
that's
years
okay.
consistently, but
Oh.
I know if you go through, you can get to Einstein's in the road, or not the roads, what's this, name of the building, but there is activity
Okay.
close. But-
I'm not venturing more than
Yeah,
100
that's
feet from
probably
here.
right.
That's why I'm getting lost.
Yeah, I was like, "Ooh."
I'll scan it and see if there's anything scintillating.
Oh, it says hi, Philip. Yeah, I don't know why you have this computer open this whole time, it's just.
We've had the exhibits side by side up there, so that's not.
Peter, do you want to be like my witness, that we're just shutting this?
If you're sending some lines out.
Hey, Phil, do you want me to minimize your screen so everybody can see inside your email? Because we're giving a show to everybody the whole day.
I forgot. Doesn't look like there's anything.
Matter if it's personal or? I was gonna help you out, but I don't wanna touch your stuff, it's like the
Hold on a
airport,
second.
you don't.
I think what she said when she rolled over there, she was gonna send out a few emails on your behalf.
Could be.
Then you walk in and
I'm
then she
pretty
had
fast, you gotta watch out.
Why not? I do not see Mr. Schweitzer, so over here, he's not here.
The dress started calling on one time. You could be, you're right around 1904 or something.
Sir.
Do you have what's wrong with Brian's number? I don't have his direct number, but you probably do. It has, yeah, he's his lawyer. I was going to say, for such a nice room, it's a highly distracting feature.
Very nice.
Mr. Stewart.
So if Mr. Embry's not here and Mr. Schweitzer is not here, then I, whatever we want to do is fine by me. But for lack of either of them being here, then I would call Ms. Cardellone. I guess what I'm saying to you guys is, since he mentioned, do we want him to stop here, you know, that kind of thing, is we can either stop or, it doesn't matter to me, but if we want to go till 2, I'll call her.
Let me just ask about Mr. Carroll. You plan on calling him, not necessarily?
Not today, I don't think, unless we're gonna end at 2:30.
Okay.
Tell him I'm sorry.
Why can't you take him after her?
I think we're gonna run out of time.
He has an emergency, you know. He really needs to know.
Who's that, Caroline?
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll have them. Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Cardelloni, is that my saying right? Cardelloni?
Yep.
So if I butcher it at some point, I apologize in advance. So you are the current treasurer for Friends of Brian Stewart?
Hey,
And when did you become the treasurer?
January 2022.
January of 2022. Was that before or after my complaints were filed?
I believe it's after.
Well, I filed one on March 4th, 2022. And then the other one was June 2022. So that would mean you were the treasurer prior to me filing.
Okay.
I don't know that it matters. So then if you were treasurer and then I filed my reports, did you receive a copy of my complaints? Did you receive copies of my complaints from the commission?
I did.
At the time I filed them? Okay. And when you received them, what actions did you take as the current treasurer of Friends of Brian Stewart?
I had a conversation with Brian.
Okay, as the current treasurer, is there any other actions that you took?
No.
Did you attempt to contact Mr. Goldstein?
I did not. I had conversations with Brian, with my boss, Natalie Bauer, and consulted. That's it.
So when you say your boss, Natalie Bauer, can you explain what you mean by your boss, Natalie Bauer, as a campaign treasurer?
Yeah, I work for a firm, N.K. Bauer and Associates.
Okay.
She is the owner and president of that company. For the past 24 years, I worked for her for the past 12.
Okay. Are you service treasurer for other candidates as well?
Brian's campaign is the only one that I'm officially listed as the treasurer.
Does the firm that you're part of, do you say Bauer? I don't want to say the name wrong, but
N.K. Bauer.
does it have other candidate clients?
We have several, yes.
Okay, so that's one of the lines of service that your firm offers.
Correct.
But you're exclusive to Brian Stewart, at least as far as, do you do other work for that firm?
For N.K. Bauer and
Yeah.
Associates, I do.
Are you a CPA?
I am.
Okay, prior to being the campaign treasurer for Brian Stewart, do you have any other experience with being a campaign treasurer?
Not officially as a campaign treasurer, but I have had a ton of experience doing campaign treasurer work.
Okay, helping with getting reports assembled and things like that. Okay. So the only action you took after receiving my complaint, my first complaint, let's break them down. So the first one was in March of 2022, was to talk with Brian Stewart and to talk with your boss.
Correct.
Did you take any steps to try to clarify anything relating to whether the mailers had gone out, which mailers, or any other allegations within the complaint?
That was all talked about in the conversations with Brian, absolutely.
But independent of Brian, did you as the campaign treasurer, under statute, take any steps other than talking to the candidate himself to verify, investigate, or understand the nature of the mailers, for example, or the radio ad?
Go ahead.
In terms of verifying whether or not the mailers went out, I think would be impossible. So that's not something I necessarily investigated. Just from working on campaigns and understanding how they operate, it's not really a great way to do that, to be honest, because like we've discussed, so many are produced and the candidate really doesn't often know what actually goes out. So I don't know how I would go about doing that.
Well, it came up earlier talking about the permits shown on the mailers. So did you make any attempt to identify who owned the permits, or what was the mail house that it's done a mailing, if a mailing took place?
I don't think that shows that a mailing actually went out.
I didn't ask you whether it showed if a mailing went out. I asked you if you took any steps.
Well, you did. You asked me if I verified it, whether or not a mailing went out.
I asked you if you verified who owned that permit.
I did not.
Okay. Did you make any attempt to verify who owned that permit?
I did not.
Did you identify, are you aware that permits align to, such as that align to specific post offices?
Yeah.
Are you aware that you can go to the post offices and they can give you reporting of what went out under that permit number?
No.
Okay. Well, now I guess you are. On the radio ad, did you make any attempt to contact anybody from strategy and media?
I did not.
Have you met Megan Fitzmartin prior to today?
I have not.
Did you make any attempt to contact anybody from Constant Content?
No.
Okay, why not?
I think because I was not the treasurer at the time that all of this happened. I know that I was listed as the treasurer and am the current treasurer, but that's the reason. There wasn't really anything for me to do when my client is telling me that he's disputing a bill. There's not further action that I'm going to take until that decision has been made. I'm not going to take action to amend a report or any of the other things.
So do you know, as treasurer, do you have an understanding that you're legally liable for the accuracy of the report?
I do.
Well, that's just a simple statement.
So, do you know whether, I just had an idea. Do you know whether and I don't know the answer, so I want to ask you, and you're in a company that does this kind of work. Do you know if a treasurer that takes the place of another treasurer has any liability to reports filed by the prior treasurer, or to correct them if they become aware of issues?
There's a liability to file accurate reports.
But my question specifically, and it's okay if you don't know the answer because I don't know the answer, do you know if that liability to correct prior reports of a prior treasurer bestows upon a current treasurer?
I'm going to object. This is a hypothetical on top of a hypothetical, and you just admitted that that's not what the law is.
I'm not sure.
I didn't admit anything about the law. I asked you.
Yeah,
said
I'm
you
not
don't
sure I
know.
understand the question, honestly. It's, the duty is to file accurate reports. If that includes an amendment, then yes, but aside from that, I'm
So-
not sure I understand.
Is it your understanding that if you become aware of an issue with a report filed under a previous treasurer, that you as the current treasurer have an obligation to make the correction of the prior report?
Yes.
Okay. Did you do any investigation into the radio ad?
In what way? Investigate how?
Whether it
I mean, I
ran, go to the
discussed it.
FCC database and pull down the invoices yourself?
I did not.
Did you make any attempt to verify?
Nor was I aware that you could. That's not really my line of work. I
Okay.
don't work in media and don't often search that information. Whatever.
Were you, and I apologize if I asked this, correct me, so I apologize if I did. Do you have any knowledge, any relationships with anybody that works at, or know anybody that works at Strategy Group for Media or Strategic Media Placement?
What do you mean by no?
No.
Like, do I know their names? Do I know them?
Let's start with, you've had any conversations with them on any
No.
topic? So you've never had
I
any
don't, not that I can recall.
with anybody from Strategic Media?
Aside from potentially a question about an invoice for a client, but no, I don't know deeply anyone in strategic media placement.
Have you worked with the Ohio Republican Party relating to their reporting of in-kinds?
I've received notices from the Ohio Republican Party of in-kinds and have and reported them. Aside from that, I haven't really worked with anyone from there.
Okay. So you don't have any personal connection or ever had any discussions of anybody from the Ohio Republican Party? related to in-kinds?
Well, one piece of my job is also fundraising, so I guess I have had discussions with the ORP about in-kinds in my career, but not specific to Brian Stewart, and definitely not specific to this case. It's a kind of broad question.
Okay. I want to direct you to look at, in my exhibits, it's going to be page number. It's going to, I'm still good from his. I want to look at it where they're all listed. I can give you a page number, but I think I'm going to refer to other pages right after that one, so I'm going to get it where they're all together. F, so it's exhibit F in my set of materials, and the page number at the bottom says 54. And then I'm going to have you go forward 2 pages to page 56. Have you ever seen that invoice before?
Just in the documents for this case,
In which documents?
the complaint.
Okay. And you see that the second line on that invoice says radio production, Stewart, $1,100.
I do.
Okay. Were you aware that Mr. Stewart turned over to me a media file of that radio ad?
I was aware that he turned over everything that was produced for his campaign as requested.
Are you now aware that there was in fact a radio ad and he provided a copy of it to me?
I was aware then, I'm aware now, yes.
So I was confused by your prior answer. Made it sound like you weren't aware, but you were aware that he gave me everything.
I was aware.
Were you specifically aware of a audio radio ad? And when did you become aware of that radio ad?
I do not recall when, but I was aware, yeah.
But prior to this hearing?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and you see that line that says $1,100?
Mm-hmm.
You would confirm that the radio ad does exist and somebody made the radio ad?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not even going to get into the radio ad airing or not. So at the time that you became aware that the radio ad did exist and that there was a bill for $1,100 for that radio ad's production, why didn't you amend a campaign finance report to show that as either an in-kind contribution or in some appropriate way?
I mean, I think there's 2 reasons. One would be the bill is to constant content. So that would be the first reason that I would not amend the report. But more importantly, I knew that this bill was being disputed by my client. So if my client is disputing a bill, I'm not going to amend and report it as dead.
I don't. Okay, so how is this bill being disputed by your client?
Well, I mean, he is disputing it, right? The first
I thought his actual disputing was on the print side of it, in the mailer side of it with Mr. Goldstein. I'm not aware of a specific dispute that your client has represented about the radio ad.
I was going to object, that's why we're sitting here.
Yeah, I'm confused by that, I'm sorry.
Okay. So you didn't, so the reason why you didn't take any action with this is because your client told you they were disputing the $1,100 charge for production of a radio ad that the client had and gave me a copy of.
No, they were refusing that the ad ever ran and that they ever received a bill from Constant Content.
But again, I'm directing you to line 2, the production cost of the ad, not the placement cost of the ad.
To me, it's one bill. I guess that's how I respond.
Do you think that if a radio ad is produced as a campaign treasurer in a firm that does campaign treasurer work, if a radio ad is produced, the candidate participates in the production of the radio ad, you become aware of a cost associated with that, that as a treasurer, you have any obligation at all?
I think that you're not always billed for the production of a radio ad if it hasn't run, and Brian, as he said, there's no proof, there's no bill, so I wouldn't amend a report to report on.
What, let's say that I had volunteered for the campaign and spent a lot of time, and somebody, you find out after the fact, somebody actually paid me to do that volunteer work for, let's say, $1,100. Do you feel you have any obligation to do anything then?
Was it approved by the campaign?
I want you to answer my question. And if there's different scenarios in which you would behave differently, then lay out the scenarios.
Can you
And
repeat?
we can phone object, I mean, she can ask for clarification, she can.
Yeah, repeat your question, and we'll go on from there.
If I volunteered for, if you thought I had been volunteering for the campaign, and then later.
Who am I in this scenario? The treasurer?
The treasurer.
Okay.
Okay? And you later found out that in reality, I was paid to work on the campaign by a third party. And let's pretend I was paid $1,100 for, say, going door to door. You thought at the time I was a volunteer, which then there's nothing reportable, but later you find I was actually compensated by a third party for doing that. Do you feel that you have any obligation then?
Not if I didn't give authorization for you to do that. It would be an independent expenditure in that case.
Okay? So let's say that the candidate was aware that there was compensated work happening. Then do you have an obligation?
Yeah, yes, I suppose you do in that case.
Did Mr.
But it would
Stewart,
also be necessary for the candidate to know that that work happened. There would have to be a letter of provided to the campaign for in-kind work done. I mean, you can't just assume someone knows something.
Well,
If
when did I
there's not
say-
anything there, especially for a treasurer who has to, I mean, I can't just file things based on someone's word. I have to see it, I have to get approval for it, it has to be accurate, there has to be checks and balances in place. Otherwise, anyone could just submit something to the campaign and be violent. I mean,
but there would be a difference, would you agree there would be a difference between I just randomly made up some bill and sent it to the campaign, and I sent a bill to the campaign, or I sent a bill to a third party who paid it on behalf of the campaign, where the candidate participated in the activities? That would imply they knew and approved of the activities?
I think that's fair, but in the scenarios that you're providing, there was a bill. Like something was sent to the campaign, which I think is the whole argument here. Brian didn't receive a bill from Constant Content. There's this, but it's not a bill to Friends of Brian Stewart. So from my perspective.
So if nobody sends a bill, if I'm a candidate, and somebody does a bunch of work for me where everybody's getting paid, but they never send me a bill, I don't have to report anything?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
If a bunch of work is happening for my campaign, and I know it's happening, and the people are being compensated, if they never send me a bill, then I have no obligation to report anything?
I think there is a scenario, yes, where that would happen, which I think is what Megan's scenario is. She's being paid a retainer by a company. She's doing work for a ton of different candidates. You don't really, like the client doesn't necessarily know exactly what every person, Majority Strategies, or whoever is paying to do that work. It's not reported, which I think Mr. Knight asked that question. Like, you're doing work for specific candidates, is that not reported on campaign finance reports? And the answer is no. She's being paid a retainer by a company. She's doing work for the candidate, but the only thing that's gonna show is the candidate paying that company that's paying for the retainer. That's just reality.
Well, the candidate here didn't pay any company,
The
right?
candidate here didn't receive an invoice.
He received a notice of collection from a place, and then as part of these complaints, he received copies of invoices that have been paid by a third party, didn't
He did, but I don't think that that implicates that he owes constant content anything without approval to move forward with the work that they provided for him with no contract
he?
provided.
In effect, is your testimony that the idea that there are consultants that are being paid, that are working on campaigns, whatever, that they don't, that that's normal to have that happen compensated and not show up on any campaign finance report? Because somebody said they can't figure out who's responsible for what part of the money.
No, I'm just trying to drive the point home that there's a lot of work that's done on campaigns that isn't necessarily reportable because other companies are paying people to do that work.
By definition, work being paid for by another company for somebody to do work for a campaign is legally required to be reported. And if the
Just not the
company,
independent expenses, like independent people working for that.
we're not
company.
talking about, just to clarify, an independent expense where the candidate had no involvement whatsoever. Wouldn't even have, we're talking about things where the candidate was in possession of copies of mailers, they did voiceover for a radio ad, it was not independent. Okay, it was something where the candidate was directly participating in. But I want to get clarification on your statement that, you know, you can't figure out there's other people paying for people to work on campaigns, and that either, I don't know what, you can clarify the statement, doesn't get reported. I think that's,
I'm just
you
saying-
just described something that's not legal.
No, I'm just trying to explain, maybe poorly, but there's work that's done on a campaign, there's stuff that is produced for a campaign that, like we said before, never goes out and isn't seen by anyone. So it's not, everything you do for a campaign isn't going to be reported. Because it may have been produced for the campaign, but they never charged the client, they never sent an invoice, and so it didn't get reported. That's all.
But
I'm
do you,
saying.
I just want to clarify your understanding. It's my understanding that if I got compensated for doing that work, that has to be reported.
Yes.
It's not a volunteer activity, it's a compensated activity.
Yeah, I think we're misunderstanding each other.
Well, what am I misunderstanding?
Just the,
I'm going to check. We're so far afield of the actual allegations of the complaint. We're now micromanaging what Megan Fitzmartin did or didn't do in a separate entity. She's not even a party.
I think that in prior cases, one of the key points has been that people show proper diligence. Did they do what a reasonable person would have done when confronted with the information in the complaint? Or did they not do what a reasonable person would do? In fact, that was cited in one of your findings. Is what a reasonable person would have done, did they show proper due diligence? I'm getting at trying to explore with the treasurer that inherited this. Prior to the complaints being filed, did she have reasonable diligence? And because of the way she's responded, I feel it's appropriate to clarify her understanding of campaign finance laws.
Okay, continue.
And I don't, did you make any attempt to contact any of the radio stations?
I did not.
Were there people other than this that were doing compensated work that had some potential benefit to the campaign, whether it was used or not potentially, that you were aware of?
No. I was not even part of this campaign at that time.
Okay. Do you think that it's normal that there's compensated work for campaigns that never gets reported on any campaign finance reports?
And that's where I think the misunderstanding was. No, I guess to answer that question directly, no.
So did you ever inquire with Megan Fitzmartin what should be reported for her?
No, I've never talked to her, no.
Will you after this?
No,
Why not?
I don't have a reason to.
Well, isn't it a reason that she testified that she was being compensated to do work that was related to the campaign and it wasn't reported anywhere because nobody asked her? Wouldn't diligence the treasurer say that now you should go ask her, what should I report?
My understanding is that is not how it works. Like, that is not how the law is written, that we have to report every single thing that someone on a retainer for a company does for a campaign.
Is your firm CPA oriented or not?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you do timesheets for how you spend your time? Are you familiar with industries like consulting and CPA firms and lawyers that every day they do timesheets, a lot of times down to 15-minute increments of what they're working on? Are you familiar with that concept?
Not really.
You're not familiar with that concept?
No, not really.
Have you ever hired an attorney?
Our firm has an attorney. I have not personally ever hired an attorney.
So you've never hired, okay. So you're not familiar with the concept of somebody keeping their time so they can report it for
I am,
proper?
yes.
So you are
I
familiar?
think I misunderstood your original question.
Okay, so that's good, because
Reporting.
but you're aware of people like accountants, consultants, lawyers,
Charging.
usually have to track, when I was a consultant for Accenture, I had to track my time every minute of the day, every day, so that it could be properly billed and allocated to clients. And I got yelled at if not enough of my time was properly billed and allocated to clients, because that's how we make money. So you're familiar with that concept, but you don't do it in your firm.
We do not.
Are you compensated for being a treasurer for campaigns?
I think we're going way off the reservation, but.
Not necessarily. I mean, it is getting a little bit far afield from where we are on the issues that are pending before us. Let's get back to that.
Okay, but let me just, I'll move on from this question. But are you compensated to be the treasurer for Friends of Brian Stewart?
I get a salary from NK Bauer and Associates.
Okay. And how are you reflected on their campaign finance reports? I think the answer's easy. I think you probably are.
What do you mean?
How are you reflected on Friends of Brian Stewart's campaign finance reports?
NK Bauer and Associates.
Because they sent an invoice, correct?
Correct.
If you were compensated by them, but not, would you have an obligation if your firm decided we're not going to charge the candidates for doing this, that there would still be some reporting by the candidate?
Can you repeat that?
So let's say that you decided you were getting compensated, but you were doing work for a candidate that your firm didn't bill. And you're being paid to do the
That
work.
would be an
Do you-
in-kind contribution.
So that would be an in-kind, and it should show on their campaign finance report.
Correct.
Okay. All right, I have no further questions at this time.
How are you, Emily?
Doing okay.
So you became treasurer for Friends of Brian Stewart, I think, in 2022, correct?
Correct.
All right, so it's like a year and a half after these activities, is that right?
That's right.
All right, and you knew that Friends of Brian Stewart is disputing these claims?
Correct.
All right, so I assume you were not looking for extra work in the sense that you knew that they were disputing these claims, so as a result of that, you were not going to spend substantial amounts of time investigating something that you were not directly involved with that's being disputed, is that correct?
Correct.
All right. And then how long have you worked at NK Bauer?
12 years.
And how long has that firm been in business?
24.
And how many candidates do you work with?
We have 14 state and federal candidates. We file reports for about 30 federal, state campaigns, PACs, and joint fundraising committees.
Okay. And I assume you handle compliance with campaign finance laws?
Yes.
And then, you're familiar with that, I assume?
Yes.
Okay. And when did you started, do you remember when in 2022 you started working with Brian Stewart?
I believe we sent in the designation of treasurer in January.
Okay, so obviously you had nothing to do with the 2020 reports, correct?
Correct.
And have you since reviewed the reports?
I have.
And are you generally familiar with them?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And do you recall Brian Stewart contacting your firm to discuss the constant content demand letter from Attorney Goldstein?
I do.
All right. And did you discuss the issue of Mr. Hicks alleging that a radio ad should have been reported as an in-kind contribution?
Mm-hmm.
And then you were aware of discussions between Friends of Brian Stewart, Natalie Bauer, and Attorney Don Bray, is that right?
I was, yes.
All right. And did Friends of Brian Stewart seek guidance about whether any amendments to the 2020 reports were necessary?
He did.
All right. And is it your recollection that your firm, Attorney Don Bray, both believe that amendments would be improper?
Correct.
And why is that?
We concluded after those conversations that as a treasurer with no bill in front of us to Friends of Brian Stewart, and then an active case here that bill is being disputed, that if we were to amend the prior reports, they would be inaccurate. If we were to amend it and say it was an outstanding debt that our client is telling us that he doesn't owe and that we're not visibly seeing, no one's able to produce the invoice for us, we concluded it would be inaccurate to file those amendments.
Okay. So as a treasurer, you don't automatically pay every demand for payment, even if you believe the demand is illegitimate, correct?
Correct.
So like if my law firm sent you a bill for $27,000, you're not just going to pay it because I say it's legitimate, right?
That's right.
Okay. And in the case of Friends of Brian Stewart, were you aware that Constant Content failed to produce any contract or proof of the amount being demanded?
Correct.
Okay. And did you or Friends of Brian Stewart ever receive an invoice from Constant Content or David Goldstein demanding $13,000?
No.
Did you or Friends of Brian Stewart ever receive a notice indicating that an in-kind expenditure for a radio ad was made on behalf of Friends of Brian Stewart?
No.
And as a treasurer, can you pay money from an account without receiving an invoice?
No. The only scenario I can think of would be a contribution refund, not an invoice, no.
Even then, there's going to be a paper trail, correct?
Correct.
There's going to be something substantiating that. Is that correct? All right. And as a treasurer, are you required to list as a debt disputed invoices that you believe are fraudulent?
No.
Do you believe that the 2020 campaign financial reports are accurate?
I do.
Do you believe they need to be amended simply because of this complaint?
I do not.
And did the Ohio Secretary of State's office ever flag these reports and indicate they believe that there were inaccuracies?
They do not.
Okay. So from the time you took over through today, you believe everything was done appropriately, is that correct?
Correct.
And no outside body has said otherwise, correct?
Correct.
And just because we're sitting here today, that doesn't necessarily mean that anything has to be amended, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And obviously, sitting here, you don't have any personal knowledge regarding anything that happened in 2019, 2020, in terms of what was approved, what was a draft, what was related to being endorsed, nothing, correct?
Zero knowledge.
And you understand that there are, for lack of a better phrase, there's multiple layers to these issues when a candidate is endorsed in terms of who pays for what, who accounts for what, and so forth. That if you're endorsed by the party, that's a whole layer of payments and issues in terms of what they pay for, what's classified as an in-kind, what could be a volunteer, versus what the campaign itself does. There's a few layers to that, right?
It's very multifaceted, yes.
Right, okay, thank you.
I just want to redirect on a few things that he brought up. I just want to clarify this. There was some representation made about engaging, I want to let you clarify it, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, Goldstein relating to his collections, demand for collections. Were you involved in any way with those demands for collection or responding to them?
I was not.
Okay, well, then I just want to clarify because it would have been confusing if you were, because that happened prior to you being the treasurer.
I
So,
was not.
yeah, so just so everybody on the commission is clear that those events were in August and September of 2021. You didn't become the treasurer until January 2022. You said Don Bray was giving advice. What's Don Bray's role in all of this?
He's an attorney, I'll defer to them. Who is Don Bray an attorney for, Brian?
At the time, he was the attorney for the Republican caucus.
Oh,
But he's not your attorney.
he's,
Okay. Were you aware that the advice that it sounds like you were getting from Don Bray involved a matter in which Don Bray was the lawyer and where now has been through all levels of the court system? In which he made those arguments that you don't have to report stuff unless you have an invoice and so on and so forth?
I think you're implying that they may know something, I'm not sure. Can you rephrase or repeat?
Are you aware at all of what transpired in the Alan Freeman case here? Where Don Bray was the attorney, which I think is a fair question because Don Bray is appearing to be involved in this matter in some way.
No, actually.
Okay, so you have no knowledge of the Alan Freeman matter or Don Bray's role in
I mean,
that?
I'm very limited knowledge.
And Don Bray is not your attorney, nor is he the attorney of your company?
Correct.
Okay, and you, there was a term used by referring to a fraudulent invoice. Was it part of the question that was asked to you? And I don't remember the exact question. But at this juncture, do you think that the $1,100 that Strategy and Media says it costs to produce the radio ad is a fraudulent invoice?
I don't,
Maybe she can answer this.
I don't know that that it's my role to determine if the invoice is fraudulent.
Well, if you're the treasurer, I guess I'm confused. I believe that the
invoice, though,
statutes put-
I'm not the treasurer
I'm sorry,
for
I'm
constant
sorry.
content.
I'm asking a question, okay? So I believe that the statutes put the treasurer in the top spot in terms of their responsibility to the reports. The fact isn't it the treasurer that signs on the reports that are submitted, not the candidate?
I'm aware. I'm just saying this invoice is not to Friends of Brian Stewart. So I don't know that I would be the one to determine whether or not it's, quote, fraudulent.
Okay, so you can't make any representation as to any of these invoices being in any way fraudulent.
I'm just referring to this invoice.
Are you making
I
a
haven't seen it.
representation that it's fraudulent?
I'm sorry?
Are you making a representation that it's fraudulent?
I'm not, no.
Okay, so I just want to clear that up because I don't believe you would have any basis to know
That's
that
exactly-
claim, make that claim. So I appreciate you clearing that up. But at this point, particularly that line of $1,100 for the production of a radio ad, however long it was, 30 seconds or 45 minutes, whatever it was that I played, I can't remember. You would admit that the radio ad exists at this point?
It does exist, yes.
Would you admit at this point that the radio ad did in fact air?
No, I have no idea if the radio ad aired.
So you believe that potentially the line on that invoice for airtime in the FCC database invoices, they could be fraudulent? I'm not asking you to say whether Brian Stewart authorized it. I'm just asking, are you willing to concede at this point that the radio ad did in fact run?
I think you've shown that it ran. You downloaded the FCC or FFC or whatever it is that shows that it ran.
So you would at this point accept that the radio ad did run?
Yes.
You would accept that the radio ad does exist?
Yes.
You would accept that Brian Stewart's voiceover is part of the radio ad?
It appears that way, yes. Yes.
But you have never made any attempts to contact Strategy and Media or anybody else to make sure that the dollar amounts that are on the invoice that they sent to Constant Content are correct, reasonable, and then take it in any step to report an in-kind contribution or otherwise relating to that?
I have not contacted the strategy group, no.
So at what point do you think that you would have an obligation as treasurer to contact somebody?
I think when it is clear that a bill is to my client. Like, this bill is from Constant Content, or to Constant Content. So when my client is telling me that he's disputing it, that he never received the bill from Constant Content for his committee to pay, then that's why I asked.
I don't, you keep referring to Mr. Stewart as your client, and I understand that context in the firm that you operate in, but you're the treasurer.
Mhm.
And I don't think the statutes have a client relationship between the candidate and treasurer where it directs the treasurer to only do what the client tells them to do or anything like that. The treasurer has an obligation
Yeah, for sure.
in that case. And at this point, you have already agreed that the radio ad exists, that the radio ad ran, that Mr. Stewart's voiceover is in the radio ad. You've been treasurer since January of 2022. And at this point, even today, your testimony is there's nothing required on your part relating to any campaign finance reporting. Is that your testimony?
I think that, yeah, that is my testimony, yes.
So when would there be anything that you would have to do?
I think that there has to be a burden of proof that my client owes the money that's on this invoice.
An in-kind contribution has nothing to do with somebody owing the money.
There was no indication of an in-kind. Couldn't this technically be an independent expenditure? I mean, there's
Not
no,
when the-
Constant Content has not issued an in-kind to Brian Stewart saying
It's-
that that's the case.
It's not an independent expenditure when the candidate was part of creating the ad. That would be the opposite of an independent expenditure.
I guess when I am looking at this as a treasurer, usually production and airtime is kind of looped into one thing, one invoice for an ad that ran. Because it could have been produced and never run, and typically a client wouldn't be invoiced for that. So that's just my experience. Whether, I mean, it's up to the commission to determine if that's incorrect, but that is my experience.
But is it also your experience that if somebody is compensated for that work, that there's an obligation that that be shown on a campaign finance report as an in-kind contribution?
Can you repeat that?
If somebody is compensated for the work,
So,
even if the candidate's not paying for it, if the person doing the work is compensated, isn't that the definition of what needs to be appear as an in-kind contribution? When it's done with the candidate's knowledge, such as making the radio ad. I'm not disputing the airtime with you, that's a separate discussion, but the making the ad, when you're in the ad, isn't that the definition of what needs to be reported as an in-kind?
I think that can be a little convoluted because something could be produced and never run, and then somebody may never bill the client for that.
It's an in-kind. You don't get a bill for an in-kind.
Because Constant Content paid for it, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. A third party paid for it. Are you aware of the difference between the ramifications of a third party who is an individual or an LLC that's treated as an individual versus a corporation doing that?
I am. I'm aware that you cannot accept contributions from a corporation, yes.
Is that any kind of, is that only cash contributions or is that cash or in-kind contributions?
Both.
Both. So if in fact the radio ad, just the production, that Brian Stewart himself personally participated in was paid for, the production was paid for by a corporation, Constant Content, shouldn't, as a treasurer, that raise all kind of alarm bells in your mind?
I guess I'm getting hung up on the fact that because there is no bill to Friends of Brian Stewart and no proof that the ad ran, that he doesn't necessarily get billed for the production of the ad.
Hold on, there's proof that the ad ran, right? We agreed the ad ran.
Sorry, yes. Proof that he approved the ad running.
Well, I've focused my questions very precisely on the production. And I would assume that since his voice is in the production, he was aware of the production. So let me ask it, my hopefully close to the last question. You are not the treasurer when this stuff happened.
Correct.
You've talked about what you've done as the treasurer after it happened. If the same series of events played out today, you became aware of Mr. Stewart participating in the production of an ad, and you never saw an invoice or never saw an in-kind, as a treasurer, would you do anything?
That's actually just not something I would most likely become aware of.
I said if you were aware of it.
In that case, yes. As the sitting treasurer, I would report.
So then would you agree that in hindsight, Nelson Embry did it wrong back then?
I can't speak to that. I have no idea what Nelson Embry did or knew about or saw.
So if, going forward, if this were happening again, and you were aware of it, you would believe something should be reported. Is that a correct statement?
If this were to happen again, I would not report anything until I saw a in-kind letter from Constant Content or which they cannot provide because they're a corporation. So at the end of the day, it would be an invoice from Constant Content for radio production.
Sure.
As the sitting treasurer, I would ask for that.
So is your
But
testimony?
I haven't seen that.
So is your testimony that the law in Ohio is that you only have to report an in-kind if somebody sends you a letter?
Well, I mean, I think just realistically, you have to know about it. Otherwise,
Well,
it would be
that's a big
independent.
distinction, okay? So it might be clear, and I want to be done. If you know about it, okay, if I had no knowledge, and that's truly an independent expenditure, that I had no involvement, no knowledge whatsoever, and I can't be expected. But if I know about it, don't I have an obligation as the treasurer to go ask the people that were involved with it, hey, where does this show up anywhere? Who made this radio ad for you?
Can you repeat one more time? I was thinking while you were talking.
So if the candidate's aware of the activity and aware of its compensated activity, don't they have some obligation? I'm just focused on the production of the radio ad.
Okay.
To go, they can just sit there and say, unless I get an in-kind letter, I never need to report anything? Kind of like, unless I get an invoice, I don't have to report anything?
I think there's just a lot happening during a campaign cycle where he may produce an ad, they're telling him, let's have this in the can, like you said, and he may produce that radio ad and give his voiceover or, take a look at 50 different mailers, and then he may not know if that mail goes out, however it goes. So I don't think he necessarily would go searching for an in-kind letter or actively say,
And I'm not
I know I
disputing,
did
so just
that. So
yes, I appreciate what you're saying, and I'm not disputing that a lot of shit happens on campaigns, but now I am disputing what happens when for 2 years you've known about it. And so with that, it's just to clarify, my last question is your feeling, your testimony today is there is no need to make any adjustments to any prior campaign finance reports, even to show some in-kind contribution related to the production of the radio ad.
I think because I was not the treasurer at the time, I can't speak to the production of the ad, like I was
Okay.
not.
I have no further questions for now.
Very briefly. So, I guess to put a bow on this, in terms of the, I think part of what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, like if you look at Exhibit 1, the reason you don't feel comfortable you couldn't report this is because Exhibit 1, page 56 of Mr. Hicks's exhibits is an invoice to Constant Content, and there's no paper trail or anything that then connects that to Friends of Brian Stewart, correct?
Correct.
So in other words, for you or any treasurer to properly fill out a report, you've got to have a proper paper trail in some way, shape, or form. Is that correct?
Correct.
And we don't see that here, correct?
Correct.
All right. And then in terms of the mailer and so forth, there was a Exhibit 8 to Respondent's Exhibit is the September 5th, 2021 letter from Friends of Brian Stewart to David Goldstein. And you've seen that letter, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And that letter disputes that the invoice from Constant Content related to that mailer. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. So, and it's your understanding in terms of, I think this is where the term fraudulent comes up, is that Mr. Stewart may have mentioned it earlier, that the reason well, there's a couple reasons, but one of the main reasons that invoice
kind of raised his attention was because he knows his relationship with Mr. Longstreth, and at that time, Mr. Longstreth had already been indicted on several issues, so not only had his campaign never seen that invoice, but just the fact that Mr. Longstreth
speech.
He'll get those questions. Go ahead, finish.
the fact that, so there was really two issues. Number one is he had never seen the invoice, number one. And then number two, knowing the relationship between Constant Content and Mr. Longstreth, is it your understanding that Mr. Stewart's radar was extra high because of that? And that's where the whole fraudulent, like, this does not seem right to me.
Right.
Is that, you understand?
Yes.
Is that fair?
Mhm.
Nothing further, thank you.
Very quick, very quick. So, but the invoice from Strategy and Media didn't come from Constant Content. It didn't come from Gary Goldstein, correct? It came from me.
The production, the.
Yeah, the invoice, he's making representations about what came from David Goldstein and so forth. The invoice that we were just talking about with the production time came from Strategy and Media and me, not from David Goldstein. Correct? Okay.
Mr. Richter, you want to follow up with anything?
I think the commission members have any questions.
Any questions? Next steps?
Well, I think we're at that point where persons are expected to leave. We'll hold off on the rest of the hearing at this point and reschedule it based on what is convenient for everybody. As best we can. I guess that's where we are at this point.
Madam Chair.
Yes, go
Do
right
we
ahead.
have another witness here?
No, not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes, me.
Well, yeah, I mean.
What's that?
I don't, with all due respect, I don't think we would conclude with you in the time period.
What time period do you have? Or we're at it, right?
We're essentially
We're at
at
it.
it.
Madam Chair, if I could, to the Executive
Yes.
Director, do we have a sense of the witnesses, and we have to be a party, so we can understand who may be called and the length of the next hearing, for the continued hearing?
Well, Nelson Albury, Scott Schweitzer, Mr. Stewart himself.
Okay, so you have 3 witnesses remaining?
Yeah. And then potentially Steve Caraway, but maybe not. It's going to be based on where we're at.
Okay, so we have 3 plus potentially Mr. Caraway, and on your behalf?
Myself and Steve Caraway, I think, are the only, and then whoever across.
So you're calling Caraway regardless?
Yes.
Okay.
Our goal would be to conclude the hearing at the next session, so if everyone could keep that in mind and be thorough, but at the same time brief, that would be appreciated.
Could the commission give us kind of a roadmap of what our time pack is at that time?
Well, in exchange of emails, you indicated the next meeting doesn't work for you, is that correct, or what?
That would be the
Obviously, I
29th.
have 3 other court hearings scheduled at the same time, so that date's not perfect. I'm saying like today, we didn't know whether we had 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours. I mean, our expectation was we were gonna finish today. I mean, we can go till 5 or 6, and I understand the commission can't, but it would help us to know that we have a 2:30 time hack.
But can we have the other people who are here to testify?
What's that? Clearly, if members of the league, I'm not saying go forward, I'm saying if we knew yesterday that we were gonna be done at 2:30, I wouldn't have.
Council,
Steve Caraway here.
we'll commit to this. Once we determine the date for the next hearing, we'll be able to determine in advance the conclusion date, because we'll address that among ourselves and we can get back to you. Let's shoot for a time that we can go until 4 or 5 o'clock. We would ask, from a reciprocal perspective, that you guys be prepared to try to complete it within that time period. But once we determine the date, I think we can commit to the time period, and we'll make sure everybody's on the same page.
Thank you.
Do we want to try to confirm a date?
The next two after this is September 12th and September 26th.
Can you commit to either of those dates?
Which were those two again?
September 12th and September 26th are the next 2 dates after August 29th.
We only have 1 commissioner.
I can do either.
I can only give one either.
No, I just,
Another hearing.
I wasn't coming Is this September 26th? Commissioning? Yeah.
So he just said,
26 is.
he said he can't do the 12th. Yeah, I can do the 26th, I can't do the 12th.
Well,
We've got two commissioners, two commissioners can't do.
So then we're October 17, October 31.
Halloween.
Commissioners,
No, come in.
at that point, you're asking me to come back 3 weeks before my election for to be held for a hearing that's 4 years old. If we can't do it in September, it'd be great to push it into November, because I mean, I can't spend the last 2 weeks of the campaign reelection here.
And I understand and respect that I'm here giving what the next dates of the commission are after that. All right, let's just conclude and we'll work on the date.
Thank you to those who have presented today. We will conclude, or we will recess this hearing until we come up with another date that everyone is available for. Thank you to the witnesses and to the open. Mr. Richter, anything else before?
Nope, not for that.
Yes, please, make a motion, please.
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
It's been moved and properly second to conclude today's meeting. Thank you. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, thank you. All in favor? We're all tired. Opposed? It's been approved by a vote of 7-0. Thank you very much.